Hey there, Nick Chatakis here. In this video, we're going to go over converting a 10-year-old 500-page blog from Jekyll to Hugo. So throughout this video, we're going to go over some lessons learned, some interesting challenges along the way, also jump into the terminal to see some code here, that's not covered in the blog post here because, I didn't want to make 1,000 different screenshots here. So actually, this is one of the cases where it's even easier to make a video than just individually making screenshots and stuff. Now, I'm going to do my best to go into as much detail as I can, but, I can't just include details literally for everything because then the video is going to be 100 hours long. I have a feeling already this might be one of the longest videos I have because this is a 10,000 word blog post. But yeah, let's get cracking, I suppose, here. So buckle up, get ready to go. But this is one heck of an adventure here that took less time than I thought it would. But yeah, here's a whole bunch of different things I learned along the way. Now, what's really funny about this one is, I actually converted my blog to Hugo back in August 2024. So it's even been more than 6 months. And I actually wrote this entire blog post back then. I just didn't publish a video or publish the post yet because I just wanted to make sure that everything was in working order and pretty stable here. And now that it's been well over 6 months, yeah, it's all good to go. I'm really happy with how it turned out here. I mostly left the blog post untouched in its original form, but I did add a little bit of new callouts there and validations about some of the assumptions back then, and also added a couple of new details about things I learned just from using Hugo for the last half a year or so. Now, one doesn't really simply wake up and decide they want to change tech stacks, on their 9 or 10-year-old blog with almost 1,000 posts and drafts. So I think before getting into the nitty-gritty on all the technical details, maybe answering the why could be pretty important. And if you don't care about that, then feel free to skip around. There's going to be a billion different timestamps, I would imagine, for this one. But yeah, Jekyll kind of gets his bad rap for being pretty slow, but that wasn't really my main motivation for switching things over. Now, if you've watched some of my videos in the past, you know that I publish a new video and a new blog post every week on Tuesday. And once a week, I would do a full site build for Jekyll, right? Producing the new blog post or whatever. And that took about 40 seconds to build on my machine that I put together over 10 years ago. That's an i5 3.2 gigahertz, 16 gigs of memory, first generation SSD, whatever. But yeah, that's not that slow, but it's also not that fast, right? But when I'm writing a blog post, imagine writing a 10,000 word blog post and every time you save the file, it would take 40 seconds to be able to see a live reload. That would actually be a problem. So Jekyll fortunately has this incremental flag that you can put. And, on my machine, again, that reduces things down to about 4 seconds. So I save the file, I can see live reload in the browser in about 4 seconds. And that's not blazing fast, but it really wasn't terrible. It was manageable, let's say. But with Hugo, I can do a full site build in about 3 or 4 seconds, and incremental builds, well, it really depends on what's being built. Some stuff is less than 100 milliseconds, or, maybe it's like a second at the most or whatever. So it is a lot faster than Jekyll there. And, most of the blog posts, even with close to 1,000 posts and drafts together, it's I'm getting near instant live reload when writing posts here. And that actually makes a gigantic difference from 4 seconds. It's something I noticed right away there. And honestly, if I knew how big of an impact that would have on writing, then I probably would have considered switching a little bit earlier. Now, the main reason I switched really is because I recently took a trip to Portugal for that Docker Captain Summit. Funny enough, I wrote this post in August, which was 2 months or whatever after I got back from there. And yeah, I just needed to get Jekyll running on my Chromebook, which is running Linux. That's a blog post that I wrote a long time ago here. Also put this thing together in 2016 or whatever it is. By the way, everything is hosted on localhost with Hugo right now, but yeah, it will be linked in the description when it's on my main site. But long story short is, this summit was a couple of days, but I took a vacation to Spain and Portugal afterwards for 2 weeks. And I like to post a blog post every Tuesday, which meant when I'm on the road there, I need some type of portable computing device, aka this Chromebook running Linux, so I can publish my blog post, that Tuesday morning or whatever it happens to be here. And, it's kind of a pain to get all that set up here because with the way things are set up for the Jekyll version of my site, I was using a very old version of this Jekyll Assets plugin. So, this is a plugin that's been supported by the community for a long time, but as you can see, it has not been touched for over 5 years, and this locked me into using a much older version of Jekyll, which also in turn locked me into using a much older version of Ruby 2.7, which has been unsupported for a long time. And yeah, you might just think well, just put it all in Docker and you're good to go here. I've been working with Docker for 10 years. I never was able to get live reloading and everything to work with combinations of all the different versions of all the different tools that I use here. So that meant getting Jekyll means getting a Ruby environment set up and everything running outside of Docker here. Now, that's not that bad, honestly. I have a lot of experience with Ruby. It's not really too big of a deal in most cases. But if you're using a Chromebook that's been modified to run Linux and you're running an operating system, Gallium OS, that has been unmaintained now for also quite a few years. So, the OS, honestly, like I even donated to the project. It's amazing. It was really good for running Linux on a Chromebook in a way that like just worked very nicely. But if you're using an unsupported Linux distro and you need very specific versions of very specific tools because some of the Ruby gems require compiling C dependencies and all sorts of other things, that becomes a big problem. And I feel like I dodged about 20 bullets just getting Jekyll to build on that Chromebook. And yeah, again, like I have 10 years of experience working with Rails. So like Ruby is not foreign to me there, but this is a pain I don't want to have to continue dealing with. And this just feels like a time bomb. Like at some point, this combination of things is just not going to work anymore. And then I'm going to be boned. Like there's nothing I can do about it. But I don't want to have to get to that point, right? Especially as I'm traveling more or whatever. I need a better computing device. Like aside from this one, this Chromebook that's 11 years old or 10 or whatever it is, it's actually good and it runs and it's great. But like, yeah, going to have to do something different if I'm going to be doing this more. But yeah, then the decision was basically like, well, do I just like refactor my way out of Jekyll assets so I can update Jekyll in Ruby? I use that plugin Jekyll assets to digest all of my assets. Basically, it adds a little hash there to the file name so that if they change, it generates a new hash. I've actually done videos in the past about Flask static digest, about cache busting there. Again, like that's really to Flask, but really, it's a general concept where I do explain that concept in a general terms there. But yeah, basically I can't not have that feature. So, if I go to my main site here, nicktonattackers.com or whatever, and we just view the source code here, and I don't know, we find, what are we going to find? I don't know, app.css, I guess. No, not going to find that. Oh, because, yeah, it's been hashed, but I think we're going to find it here. So this is what we're talking about here, right? So we have a file name called app, and then we have .css, but in between there, we have that hash, and that's what Jekyll assets was doing. And then also, again, I was able to figure how to do this out in Hugo. But in long story short here, I just wanted to see like, well, maybe there's an alternative, right, to using Jekyll assets. We can figure this out in a different way. But if I didn't find that, then it's like, well, maybe it's time to consider approaching this from ground zero. And by the way, I did look all over the internet for ways to make this work with Jekyll, and it just didn't seem worth it. There was just too many new things. So at this point, it's like, you know what? Ground zero, let's go. Let me take every single pain point I encountered for the last 10 years and see if I can solve literally all of them and do the best I can at least, right? And really, Jekyll wasn't that bad to use. I used it for 10 years, a decade of my life, 500 blog posts, and like at this point, 1,000 drafts. So clearly it worked. Clearly it did a good job. But, things move on. Things could get potentially better, right? So yeah, it's time for the grand rewrite. And in this case, I think it actually made sense. And I always knew Hugo was fast and quite popular, right? I even toyed with the idea of switching to it quite a few different years ago, but I really just didn't have enough of a compelling reason there. I do know, though, that Docker's documentation is also built with Hugo, which gave me a really big confidence boost that like it can actually be used to set up a very complex project there. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even bother really looking at other solutions because I know having a super fast statically compiled binary solution, which is, Go is going to produce that, it's pretty much as good as it gets, right? In terms of like just this thing is going to be fast. It has a lot of features. Like what else is really going to be better than using Hugo at this point? I will say this though, having this idea of switching over to Hugo or something else in the back of my mind for those 2 or 3 years, that really created a mental tax. So it's like every time that thought popped up into my mind, it made me think like, oh man, I'm slacking off by not doing it or avoiding something that I should air quotes do, but I wasn't doing it. So yeah, I decided, you know what, it's time to go into hardcore learning mode and actually do the grand rewrite and actually do it. And 30 hours later, which was about 3 really, really long days, my whole entire site was converted with a combination of just like Python script, shell scripts, manual checking, doing all sorts of different things. And we're going to go over all that stuff in the blog post, some of it. And yeah, I broke that up into a couple of different days. And really when it was all done, it was like this major relief, like this massive mental tax just disappeared. And it felt pretty freaking good. And by the way, I had no idea it was going to take 30 hours. I actually thought it was going to take a hell of a lot longer here, which is also why I was very, very reluctant to even start the project here. And there were just so many different unknowns, right, that I first had to figure out. And I'm sure you know, right, if you have a whole bunch of different unknowns, that's a really, really great way just to talk yourself out of doing anything. I kind of thought like, you know what? Okay, I've learned new complicated things or whatever in the past. Let me see if I can actually solve the bigger problems before I even start this whole entire thing. And that doesn't mean necessarily coding up a solution in Hugo, but it's more just like, it's just getting a lay of the land, understanding what's going to be challenging, what's not going to be challenging. Can we actually solve some of these problems here? Just going back to here, it's like, you want to sort of do this maybe up front before you invest a massive amount of time into something here. It seemed like a pretty reasonable first step here. And, it's not just like, oh, let me Google around for like a Jekyll to Hugo converter. And then like, you're going to find some project on GitHub and install it and run it. And you're going to have a full working solution in 10 seconds. No freaking way. Like, now when you have a site that has that many posts there, I also have quite a few different Jekyll plugins that I was using. Some of them were written by other people. Some of them were written by myself. And we're going to go over some of them here and how that functionality can be replaced with Hugo as well. But long story short, this is not just like a trivial thing. It's not just like, oh, a tool is going to do that with me in 5 minutes. But, one of the plugins that I was using was just like, it scans the Jekyll plugins, by the way. It scans all of my links, like an href or whatever. And if it was an external link, meaning if it were like example.com or youtube.com or something that wasn't nickjanatakis.com, that's my main site here, then it actually added this attribute to the links. So target, _ blank, so that when you click the link, then it would automatically open it up in a new tab. And that's handy, just makes it a little bit easier. Like, if you're clicking links within my site, for example, a good example here, I click the photo gallery, you're not leaving this domain, so it just goes right to here. But if you were to click like a different link, like this one, this is actually, I just left click that normal. It just popped open into a new tab here. And of course, if you want to middle click this one, you can. It opens it up in a new tab in the background. This is default browser behavior. But yeah, I wanted this target blank there so that when you click external links, you don't leave my site. And yeah, that was a plugin that just basically scanned all the different links, found out if it was external, and then yeah, added this, otherwise skip doing stuff. Now, other plugins that I had here was just like pulling in tweets from Twitter, so I can actually embed tweets into my posts. I don't have an example to show off the top of my head, but I'm sure you get the idea there. And then there was also other ones too that I built custom, which was basically this idea of a quick jump. So this exists even current day in my site, where you have a little table of contents there. You can just click into one of these, it jumps you right down to where you are. Yeah, essentially a table of contents there. So I wanted to be able to do that in Hugo as well. Again, that was a custom Jekyll plugin I wrote there. Yeah, also, this photo gallery we just took a look at here, let's open it up. Doesn't really matter. I don't really link to this anywhere on my main site, but it's here, 500 photos of when I went to Boston, like a decade ago almost. And, it's kind of cool, whatever. It happens to be just a photo gallery. You can click around and look at some stuff. But long story short, that is just YAML data that I loop over and have some template logic to generate that photo gallery. So I wanted to be able to do something like that. Another technical challenge was making sure my URLs don't change for both the pages and also for the assets, right? The images as well. And, that means I need to digest these assets in the same exact format as Jekyll assets. So going back to, whatever, yeah, the long hash there in the image file name, that needs to be the same, because I'm really not going to 301 redirect, which is a permanent HTTP redirect, on 1,000 images. I don't want to mess with any of my SEO or anything like that here. So that, to me, was a deal breaker if I couldn't solve that. To me, that's a big thing that had to be solved. Also, I encountered a lot of resistance with how Hugo deals with trailing slashes in its URLs. So it really, at least at the time of making this video, you have two options. You can either use ugly URLs where, in this case, if you take a look here at the URL, let's ignore this part here, then you have, converting my 500 pages from Jekyll to Hugo, right? That's the URL of this blog post here. But if you used ugly URLs instead, what would happen is you would end up with .html here instead of a trailing /. And this is an option that you can configure with Hugo. Do you want ugly URLs? Then you're going to HTML. If you don't, then you're going to get pretty URLs, and every URL is going to end with a trailing /, right? You're going to have about / instead of about. And in my opinion, that was kind of a deal breaker for me, right? From a technical perspective, because in my existing blog with Jekyll, I didn't have these trailing slashes here. Like when you went to the about page, it looked like this with no trailing /. And there's no way I wanted to 301 redirect 500 blog posts, a decade of SEO to every single blog post that I ever wrote. I know technically, I guess 301 redirects, it might be a temporary SEO hit. I don't really know. Who really knows Google's algorithms, right? But in any case, it's a boat I didn't want to rock. And I also thought like, well, worst comes to worst. I guess maybe I can write a tool after Hugo builds the site then I can just use some sed or maybe write a Python script and just like go over every single link that was generated and then just remove the trailing slash if it's a link that belongs to my domain or something like that. And that would be really disgusting. I didn't want to have to do that, but that was like a last resort, like move maybe. And weirdly enough, I actually broke this rule of, figuring out all of these challenges before I go at it, because I don't know, I mentally agreed with myself, no matter what, I'm going to figure something out. Like the URL problem is going to not exist. I will figure it out. And I will say sheer determination is like actually a pretty powerful thing here. I did figure out a way to do it with Hugo. It's not documented, didn't find it on the internet, literally had to invent a solution here, which we're going to get into. But yeah, it works basically. And as for the other bigger challenges there that we discussed before, I did confirm that it will be possible to pull them off. Now, there's a billion other smaller technical hurdles, but the above ones were the pretty big ones. So we're good, right? We're really doing this. Time to migrate. Maybe not yet. Because now we have another decision here, a decently big one too. It's like, are we going to go with a completely fresh new theme or just keep things the same? And, my theme is currently a custom vanilla bootstrap theme that I made years ago. It's not from like a template site or whatever. It's not like I don't not like it. I think it's pretty cool. It's fairly minimal, pretty easy to read text, not super, stuff in your face. I know this is, on the left here, I'm zoomed in so much and normally that's super far away. But yeah, maybe some point I will actually make a new theme. But yeah, another interesting bigger challenge there was Jekyll assets, because the way I had this set up 10 years ago, I was using SCSS there and also JavaScript. And so Jekyll assets is using a Ruby library called Sprockets here to bundle all that stuff up. And in my other projects, not related to Jekyll, I've been using ESBuild and Tailwind for, 5+ years, however long it's been basically. And I decided with Hugo that I actually want to use ESBuild and, maybe Tailwind at some point in the future too. But I didn't want to have to convert all of my SCSS and JavaScript and other stuff, into ESBuild or whatever. So I ultimately decided, you know what, this is already one big move to go from Jekyll to Hugo. Trying to redo my theme from scratch at the same time, it's too much. So this is something that can be done incrementally. Get everything running on Hugo first with my existing theme, and then consider switching over to a different theme when it's stable. So yeah, I ended up taking the non-minified and concatenated files here for CSS and JavaScript. I just took those straight from Jekyll and I plopped them right into the ESBuild setup here with Hugo. Without Tailwind for now. That could be done whenever I change themes. And this was pretty painless. Honestly, like it just worked. Then ESBuild kicked in using the normal ESBuild configs that I had previously with my other Docker setups here. And it produced production builds in a great way. So like if I go to here, we take a look here. Let me just close that for now. I guess we'll take a look at that in the future. But yeah, if I go to, where am I going now? Apps.css, sure. So this file here is what Jekyll produced when it built things. I just produced a non-minified version of it so I can actually deal with this as a human being. But yeah, if I really want to change some of my CSS and my theme, which by the way doesn't really change because it's pretty stable, then yeah, I can just go into this one file here and ESBuild is going to generate a new CSS file that actually Hugo will use. And then whatever, it's going to generate the right thing. So I still have the capability to edit stuff, but yeah, it's all just like packed in one file now for now. It's not the big deal, but it's like something to think about here. But okay, cool. So theme problem is solved. Deal with it tomorrow, basically, or whenever, phase 2. So now the next thing is like, well, let's talk a little bit about like high level features. So it's like, I know I had to convert 500 blog posts, right? From Jekyll's liquid templating language to Hugo's Go template language. But in my mind, that's pretty easy. I mean, that's just like grinding it out, right? Going template to template, maybe automating a whole bunch of different things, parts of that with Python or shell scripts or whatever. And whatever else you can't do in an automated way, then just go in and actually just do it manually, right? I really didn't even think about this part until I identified all the different features that I need to convert over. And by the way, this is going to be a real long video, I think, because I'm just looking at the scroll bar. It's already been 20 minutes and like this is going to be 2-something hours. So I'm going to get a drink. So for this feature dump here, right, I didn't really care about ordering or prioritizing them. I just wanted this stuff out of my head there, so I just dumped it into plain text. Now, I've actually done videos in the past, right, about that note script that I wrote. I'm still using that 20 years later. I think it's great. So in any case here, this wasn't meant to be a perfect or a complete list. It was just give me a rough idea of the scope of the project here. I can always add to it later as I go. But yeah, initially I just gave myself about a half an hour and just started dumping over some of the stuff here. And we're going to go over, in code some of the stuff here. But yeah, right, we want pretty URLs without trailing slashes. We want to be able to show the N latest post here. So if I go to the blog here, actually, no, let me go to the version of it on my site, just so it's a little bit easier to bounce around. Here. Okay, cool. So we have latest tips and tricks, right? We have about 12 of them. We have 3, 6, 9, 12. So it just shows the latest number of posts there. So that's what that is. I want that feature. I also want pagination. So if we go to the blog up here, right, and then we go down to the bottom, let me zoom out a little more. That's a little bit crazy, actually. There is this pagination over here where we have different pages, right? Let's jump to page 3. Cool. We're on page 3. Let's go to the very end. I don't know what it is. Page 27. So however many blog posts there are per page, 20, something like that. But we need pagination, sure. We also want to be able to generate a table of contents, basically that quick jump that we looked at very briefly before. We also want the ability to be able to filter by different tags for the different posts that we have. For example, we go back to the blog section here. You can see you can filter things. If I want to look at all the Docker posts here, you could see now it's highlighted to be that we're in the tag Docker. And then we could see all the different Docker posts that I have here, which is at this point, I don't know how many there are, like well over 100, that's for sure. So we want to be able to do that. We also want to be the ability to organize our draft posts into a separate directory. Now, I'm sort of making some claims here in this video or assumptions that maybe you know a little bit about Jekyll or Hugo ahead of time. But yeah, Jekyll basically had this idea of drafts that were in their own directory. And then also you have posts that are also in their own directory. So in case you haven't seen that concept before, here we have a drafts directory, right? And then we also have a post directory. And the difference between a post and a draft is if you're going to be building your live site, it wouldn't include drafts. And yeah, I just wanted to make sure Hugo can actually do that as well, or at least some idea of what a draft is. Then also embedding YouTube videos, super important. If I click into here, scroll down here, you can see a YouTube video that's embedded into the post over here. This is just using an iframe, embedding things in the way that YouTube suggests there. And then also embedding tweets. I definitely don't have an example of that in this post. I don't know. Maybe we can find this one later, but yeah, I'm sure you get the idea, right? You can just embed a little Twitter card here just by maybe putting in a tweet ID or Twitter ID or whatever it happens to be. Cool. Then we also have, digesting, right? Images, CSS, images, etc. But also the ability not to digest certain images, right? I don't want those image gallery ones like that Boston trip with 500 images. I don't really care about digesting them. So maybe let's not digest those just because it's going to be processing hundreds of images and, there's compute time or whatever, and people may link to things. I don't know. I just didn't feel like digesting those. Cool. Okay. Then we want to be able to minify the final HTML if we want to. Then we also want live reload for local development. Super important, right? You got to be able to write a blog post side by side with your, site here and just see the changes as you are saving the file. Then also, yeah, we want the ability to see drafts in future posts, but only in development, right? What is a future post? Well, you can imagine you might have a post that's dated a week from now. In development, you want to be able to still see that in your list of posts, but you wouldn't want that published if you were to build your site and push it, right? Because it's in the future. So you want that. Then we want external links to be able to open up into a new browser window. We are going to take a look at that. And then, we took a look at that actually a couple of minutes ago or wherever, 10 minutes ago. Then we also want this ability to split out different content types, right? You have this idea of a blog or a course or, some other page that you might have or whatever it happens to be here, right? Then we also have this ability to toggle different features on a per page basis. For example, comments, right? If you go to here and scroll down, there are discuss comments here. And, I'm crying on the inside because nobody commented on my multi-stage build video here. Not a big deal, but whatever. Maybe there's an affiliate link call out because maybe a page has that. Maybe you want to show a different newsletter form, or maybe you want tables of content disabled on certain pages. For example, if I go to the about page here, it's just a dump about some stuff about me. You can see that there is no comments here with discuss because I have that turned off because I don't want that on the about page. But I also don't have a table of contents here as well. And there's no affiliate links on the about page or whatever. But it's these are things that could be turned on and off on a per page basis. Then we really would like to have the ability to use the template helpers available to us to generate all of the links for all the different pages within our site so that we can protect ourselves against having dead links. So for example, if I just jumped in here and I don't know, I'm not going to go crazy typing a lot of custom stuff here, but like if you just like try to make a regular link, right? And you just put in hello world, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Like here, if you just type this in and you maybe, assuming you have a blog title of hello world, if you just like screwed up and put in like 2 O's there, then this link is dead. But like Hugo is still going to build this site and you can end up having a dead link there. So you want to make sure that, or at least I wanted to make sure that I'm using template helpers that exist with Hugo, because Jekyll had them as well, to generate all my links with those helpers, because those will detect typos. Like there's just site will not build if you have a broken link there. So it really protects you against yourself, which is super important when you're dealing with a big site, or even any site, in my opinion. Also, you want this ability to segment template logic into different partials, basically little smaller files that you can include into other files, just so you can, remove duplication, make things a little bit easier to work with. Just, organize your stuff as if it's a code base, basically. Then we want the ability to load data in from YAML files, we'll see this in a bit, I suppose. And then also, generate a sitemap, generate an RSS feed, generate a robots.txt file. And then also, Twitter and Open Graph tags would be useful to have. For example, here's my Twitter account here. Every time I make a post here to something, if I link to one of my sites here, this little card that pops up is an Open Graph tag, which is pretty cool. Technically, it's a Twitter tag because there's some variants on Open Graph, but this is really like the main protocol to do that. It basically just comes down to printing certain attributes in the head of your HTML, but it would be really nice to have that be able to be abstracted away and just handled so it just works, air quotes. And then also the fave icon. You can see I have a little, NJ logos here for my name. Just want to be able to generate those at different sizes, right? Because, on a desktop device, you might have like a 32 by 32 PNG or a 16 by 16 ICO file, but maybe on an iPad or whatever, you might have a bigger like 128 by 128 image there. Okay, cool. So, this is basically high level features of the blog. This is all the things my blog does from a feature perspective. Maybe there's more things, but basically that's the high level stuff. But yeah, what this exercise let me confirm was there's really not a whole lot to this here, which is going to be uncharted territory. So most of these things are pretty straightforward, where, I could check the docs or just Google around, or maybe even use ChatGPT at this point if I really wanted to here for the specific syntax on actually how to solve some of this stuff here, right? I can always Google around, like, how do you generate a sitemap with Hugo or something like that, right? And find a bunch of leads on this one. So this was really one of my first big wins of the project, right? It's doable. It's going to happen. These things are all achievable here. And yeah, this really puts me into a different mindset here, because it's almost like the hard part's done. The rest is kind of just like figuring out the implementation details. And by the way, these aren't all trivial here. Some of these are actually pretty tricky to find out here, and hopefully you get some value from, discovering some of that stuff in this post here. But, now that we know, like, hey, it's going to happen, let's actually do it. Let's actually do it now, right? So it's like, hello world with Hugo. And by the way, this video is not going to be like following along to actually do this stuff. But yeah, the first thing I really had to do though was just get the project up and running. And what that actually means for me is getting Hugo running along with ES-Build. And, now that we're just dealing with more than Hugo, because Hugo is a statically generated binary file, right? You just download the one for your CPU architecture and OS and you can run it. That would be fine to maybe run without Docker, but now it's like, yeah, but you want ES-Build and you want to do this, you want to do that, etc. So I'm like, using Docker even for this would be a really good match, right? I can just do a Docker compose up. It's going to run Hugo. It's going to run, ES-Build. It's going to run Tailwind in the future. And the nice thing about that is, I have all these different Dockerized applications here for Rails and Django and Phoenix and Node and Flask. Don't have any yet for Hugo that I published, but I could probably extract that out from this project here. Not important, but in any case here, I basically just used, I think the Flask one as inspiration here. And yeah, within 10 minutes, I had a working solution with Hugo. And honestly, this stuff isn't open source yet, but it's like, it's just a Docker file with some nonsense and comments in here that, I can clean this up before I were to ever open source it. But it's like, I've got a node-based image here that builds things. And then also we have, one that basically just downloads a specific version of Hugo, gets things running here. It actually just uses volume mounts. Don't even need to copy it in. And again, the focus of this video is not to be a deep dive on the Docker stuff, but I just wanted to give you a quick peek into some of the Docker things here where, yeah, it's like we're just starting up ES-Build, and maybe if we wanted to in the future Tailwind, it just basically just runs Hugo server in development here. And yeah, it was surprisingly easy to wire up here. Yeah, okay, cool. So maybe in the future, I'll open source that and clean it up a bit. I actually ran into problem number 1 here, which was Hugo is pretty freaking fast. So, one fun problem I had here is ESBuild is configured to produce JavaScript and CSS files in a public directory, just public slash, like in the root of the project, right? And I configured Hugo to read assets from that directory. And what was crazy here is that ESBuild, by the way, is also quite fast and written in Go or whatever. It's a quick tool. But Hugo was starting up faster than ESBuild could produce these assets. And it ended up making it so that every once in a while, like, I don't know, 50, 60, 70% of the time when I started project up, Hugo would win. Hugo would come up first. Assets wouldn't be available. Hugo is going to be like, yo, dude, I'm looking for assets in this directory. They're not there. Sorry, bye. And then error out. So what I ended up having to do to solve this problem was in the entry point of the Docker setup here, I just set up this little loop here. And we can actually look at it. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see in the code. So code editor, I mean. So if we go here, it's basically just what we see here. And here's the situation, right? It's like, well, we just, this is a shell script, by the way, that runs before the Hugo server runs. I'm not going to go deep diving into entry point scripts of Docker in this video. But in any case, it's just doing a while loop, basically, well, the opposite, like an until loop. But it's like, we want to make sure we have an app.css file and an app.js file. Oh, we don't have one yet? Okay, let me sleep for 250 milliseconds. Okay, let me loop again. Hey, by the way, did ESBuild finish? Did it produce these files yet? No? Okay, cool. Let me loop again. Oh, cool. Now we actually do have a CSS file. Ah, nice. And we have a JavaScript file too, and we're done. We break the loop, and then Hugo is just going to start. And yeah, that's really all it took there. And, this wasn't a solution that I just found in any documentation. Like, just, I don't know, I happen to be a developer. It's like you just think about the problem to be like, okay, well, Hugo is starting too fast. What could I do? Well, there are things like depends on with Docker Compose. And, maybe you could work a solution with that. But typically the default behavior of depends on is, if you do something like, having Hugo and then you have depends on ESBuild or whatever, your other container is doing this, then they're both just going to start at effectively the same time. It's not going to wait until one of them is ready or whatever. But yeah, maybe you could wire something up. It depends on to like look for a specific file. There's all sorts of different details you can do. But yeah, this one seemed pretty easy. And it hasn't failed yet in about 1,000 times of upping it. Just because like, yeah, I mean, if I ever get to the point where this thing didn't start, like I would know why, because it's like one of these files didn't exist here. But yeah, once I got all this stuff here up and running, then it was basically just time to learn Hugo. And, I'm going to spare you the details here. I've written about things like this in the past or made videos about finding answers reliably. I'll leave a card to that one, but it just really comes down to Googling for very specific problems. And then, at least for me, like optimizing very short feedback loops, right? So, ask a question, find some type of solution to try, and then actually try it out. And then, keep looping until it works. And then move on to the next question. And then basically repeat that 1,000 times until the thing that you want to learn is learned. And yeah, that video goes into like where to find the stuff. Google, YouTube, documentation, GitHub discussions, issues, whatever it happens to be, books, courses, all that stuff here. By the way, I didn't take any courses or read any books. It was all just like self-driven development on, just Googling essentially. But yeah, one nice perk of this migration, by the way, is I already had the answer book in front of me. And I feel like, a lot of times when people talk about the grand rewrite, at least the benefit that you do have is like you have a working solution of the old thing that you can just use as a guidebook, right? So I kept my Jekyll server running locally and I constantly compared the output to Hugo's output just to make sure it at least looks the same there. And yeah, that was like wildly useful here. And yeah, I just like started with the homepage and then that uncovered a whole bunch of different challenges. Like for example, you want to be able to do the latest 12 posts or whatever it happens to be here. So, there's stuff like that. Like how do I get the latest 10 posts with Hugo? I was Googling for stuff like that until I found what I need to do here. It's not worth, by the way, walking through literally everything I learned while I'm, converting this here. So let's focus a little bit first on some of the terms, like the differences between the tools, and then go over some of the more interesting challenges and features for, all the different things. And yeah, 35 minutes now, and that scroll bar barely moved. So I'm actually a little worried on how long this video is going to be. So let's compare some terms for Hugo and Jekyll here. And by the way, all the different terms that you see here are the Hugo variant. But yeah, sometimes, they exist in both. Like for example, Hugo and Jekyll both have this idea of a layout. This is being able to just set up layout files that you can then use and then pass blocks around as needed to customize that. For example, if I do a search here for layout, I don't know, like maybe the blog single.html or whatever, this is just a layout file that has a block main, and then there's some code in here to do certain things here. So this is blog single. So basically what this is, every blog post that gets rendered, the individual post, like for example, if we go to this and then click on this, like this page that we're looking at right here is being rendered by that layout here. You can see there's like updated on, and then some date, and then there's a title, then there's an image. So then we also have things like here, it's like, yeah, there's updated on. There are some tags there as well. I didn't mention that a second ago, but yeah, there's a title, there's an image if it's available, table of contents, and like throughout the content, which is the markdown file. So, it's basically just a layout file essentially. Again, this video is not meant to be a step-by-step guide on what all these things are. I'm assuming you probably have some experience with this stuff. And then there's this idea of a partial. So Jekyll uses include, and then, whatever the file that you want to include. Hugo has a very similar thing too. It just happens to be called partial. You can see right away too, there's some differences in the templating syntax here, right? This is Go's templating language, and this is Liquid with Jekyll. But yeah, same concept. This could be in a different directory. You can just put the directory path here first and you're good to go. Then in Hugo, you have these things called shortcodes. So you can sort of think of this as wrapping up some custom logic to use in your content. Maybe you're embedding a YouTube video or creating links or doing whatever you need to do basically. And with Jekyll, typically you probably would use an include for this. For example, if we go and take a look at some Jekyll code here, I've got this one embed include that I created a long time ago, and it allows me to very quickly or easily embed YouTube videos where I just basically pass in the YouTube video ID and then it just works. So here it's just outputting basically an iframe, from Google or from YouTube's like sharing functionality. And yeah, you just pass in like a UID there and then you're good to go. For example, on how to use this, I can just do something like embed whatever, and then we'll take a look at the usage. So yeah, you can just be like, well, what's a type? It's YouTube. What are you passing in? There's the YouTube ID. And yeah, what shortcodes with Hugo, it's very similar, but it's different. If I go to 2025, like whatever, some blog post from the other day or the other week or whatever, we go down here, we can actually see a very similar thing. So this is a Hugo shortcode, and the syntax is different, but you can see you just pass in a YouTube ID and you're good to go. This is actually built into Hugo. I didn't have to create a custom thing for that. But yeah, that's one difference there. So just going back to here, that's shortcodes basically. There's a whole bunch of other ones we're going to go over throughout the video. Then we have this idea of functions. So basically, Hugo has a whole bunch of different functions that you can call in your templates there. You can trim strings, you can do some math stuff, you can, convert things to lowercase or do some hashing, whatever you want. And then Jekyll, these are called tags. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of them as well too. Maybe there's not a direct one-to-one for every single one between both solutions, but the concept-wise, it's basically the same thing between tags with Jekyll and functions with Hugo. Then you have this concept of frontmatter. They exist in both. Hugo supports, YAML, TOML, JSON. I know Jekyll supports at least YAML. I honestly don't know if it supports other ones. Not super important, but if we take a look here at the differences, if we go to the top of this file and the top of this file, this is the frontmatter. So it's what you see at the top of the file, starting with the triple hyphens here. Yeah, I used different conventions here when I decided to move to Jekyll or move to Hugo. But yeah, the idea is the same, right? Have some YAML in this case to just put things in here that are going to be different for each individual post. So, here's a whole bunch of different posts here right on top. If I go to the different posts, you can see different content, right? They're going to have different front matter, basically a different title, different description, different image for the card, or different tags, stuff like that. It allows you to customize each individual post or whatever content that you have in a pretty nice, easy, consistent, data-driven way. So that's what front matter is at, super high level. Then we have this idea of a content. These are content pages. This is where your markdown files go. And, in Hugo, like a blog post, it's just a type of content. And in Jekyll, this is a lot different because in Jekyll, you have this idea of, let me just go here. We have this idea of like a post directory and all of your posts are there. Then you also have a drafts directory and all of your drafts are there. These are like special constructs created by Jekyll itself, but Hugo has no such thing as like, what is a blog? You have to like make what a blog is because it really could be anything. So in this case, we have a content directory, and then you can have, blog or courses, or in this case, you can see how I split drafts out. We're going to go into more detail in that a bit. But yeah, these different pages or whatever are different types of content. So there's that as a little difference. And then also there's like config values or Config files for both tools support that. You can also have environment-specific configs, like a general config, but then you override stuff in development and production. So for example, if I go to, I don't even know what it is in this case, I think maybe default. I'm trying to think how I even name this one. Yeah, it's config.yaml. So yeah, this is a Jekyll config where you have like the locale and the URL and all sorts of things like my phone number, which, yep, I'm going to be blurring that one out, that's for sure. And then, yeah, you can override this with like production configs as well. So I don't even know what I named it. Let me just go, well, you know what? It actually defaults to production with the Jekyll one. And then I override certain things in dev, like localhost for the URL. And, you know, I don't have Google Analytics or Discuss or whatever. And then Hugo has very similar stuff here too. So if you go to config, here's like the default config. You know, I have things commented out. Again, this project is not open source, so I have more comments than normal just for my own self here. But yeah, you have like things like the base URL and all sorts of different things. And then also we have, you know, other config here too for production, where in production, it's like, yeah, let's set the base URL to this one. I also have some little comments here for myself to when I was playing around with stuff testing wise. But yeah, I actually don't even use Google Analytics anymore. Even though it's hooked up, it's not like a live key. But in any case, yeah, you have this option in both. Cool. Okay. So there's all sorts of other things too to talk about, like, you know, assets and static files and data files. And, you know, these are named about the same in both tools here, but there's also this concept of themes in both. I'm actually not using themes in any of my solutions for Jekyll or Hugo. You know, I just have basically my own theme that I created with Bootstrap. You know, it's not pulling in that, but yeah, they exist in both. And then also there's, you know, a ton of different Hugo specific things for content management. We're not going to be covering that in this post here, but yeah, I left the link here so you can take a look here if you want to, you know, learn about more of these things here. Okay. So with that said, let's go over some noteworthy comparisons, things that are worth going over, you know, because again, we don't want to cover very specific, like individual things for everything. Like, how do you define a variable in Liquid versus Go? Well, you can just Google for that one. How do you do a for loop versus a for in loop? Again, Google. But yeah, let's focus on some interesting ones here. And that's going to begin with getting files to be dated with YYY, month, DD as their prefix. For example, you know, with Jekyll, this just works out of the box because it's basically built into Jekyll. So for example, going back down here, if we take a look here at the post, they all start with a date, you know, the year, month, day, and then the title of your post here in the post directory. And, you know, with Hugo, that's not built in. You can do this without a lot of configuration. You can see it's not too crazy to get going, but it's not like a, you know, part of, I don't know, the tool or the framework or whatever. And, you know, with Jekyll too, even though the date is in the file name, you can actually hide the date from the URL. And that's what I did too in my Jekyll setup. In my Jekyll config, I have the permalink, which is basically the URL there, just to be blog / and then the slug. And the slug is really just going to be, let me go back to one of the posts here. Yeah, in this case, the slug is just going to be, it ends up being the file name without the date component there, right? So in this case, it would be like hooking up like this basically, but with dashes and lowercase, you know, it's basically the file that you see here on the bottom. So that's what the slug is there. In Jekyll's, you know, terminology here too. And, you know, that's a personal preference. If you didn't want that and you actually do want the dates in the URL, then you can just not set the permalink and then you can use Jekyll's defaults or, you know, include the date there as well. Okay, so Hugo doesn't enforce this, right? Because it doesn't really have a notion of like a post or whatever, but you can really get the same effect pretty easily by just going to your Hugo config, adding this frontmatter date, and then you can just do file name and then default. And file name, you know, that's going to include the YYY, month, day to day or whatever. And, yeah, then you're good to go here. And if with no other further configuration, if you did this, you can have your files on disk like that, but then your URLs are going to look like this. And, you know, we'll talk about that trailing slash a little bit later. But yeah, like why even put the date in the file name, even though it's not going to be in the URL? That's a good question. So like when you have over 500 posts, or really honestly, I was feeling this pain with just, I don't know, maybe a year's worth or a couple of years worth of posts. You know, having them naturally sorted really is super helpful, just to know like, oh, you know, if I go here and take a look at all my posts, they're all in order, like just from, you know, older to newer, all the way until the bottom here until we get, well, there's a lot of things expanded there, but yeah, there's the latest post there. Super useful to have when you're glancing things, but it's also super useful to have when you're fuzzy matching files, for example, you know, well, maybe I'll just go back to here because there's been so many times where like I knew I wrote something like maybe in the summer of 2022, but I actually forgot the actual title of the post. So it's like, I can't even like fuzzy match on the file name because I don't even know what the file name is. You know, sometimes I'll figure out like one word or two and then be able to find it in the list. But having these dated files, yeah, it just lets you do a fuzzy match for like, you know, 2022 07. And then you can be like, oh, well, here's like, 4 posts I wrote then, or maybe, here's some from May or whatever. You can very quickly just like get an idea of where things are and like when they're from. And that's like really handy to have. And if you don't have these things dated, then you just won't be able to do that type of thing because the date's not going to be in there. All right, cool. So let's go over another interesting, little challenge here, which was creating separate directories for your drafts. So, I mentioned this already a few times here, but with Jekyll, you have a drafts directory and all the drafts are going to be in there. But yeah, there's no concept of that type of thing with Hugo. So it's like you need to invent that if you want that. And, with Hugo by default, like you can always just put draft true in your front matter. So going back to here, if I really wanted to, I could just do something like draft true. And now suddenly this would be a draft. And you can imagine though, if you had 500 blog posts all in one big directory, and then you also had like 500 drafts also in that one directory, how would you know what's live on your site and what's a draft? By looking just at like the directory structure, you wouldn't. You'd have to like go into every single individual file and then just like look to see if draft true is set. And that's definitely not something I wanted to do. I really, really, really wanted to have both the posts and the drafts being in their separate directories here. And again, not even just to human glanceability perspective, you want to be able to sometimes fuzzy find files and just put like draft space, whatever. And like, that's going to be a draft because it's going to be part of the path. So this was actually surprisingly easy to do in Hugo, but tricky as hell to figure out what features of Hugo you actually have to use to achieve that. So what you could do here is, I decided to, and that's why we're looking at this URL in a drafts directory. I made a new content type called drafts, and there's the index.markdown file. And again, I'm not like lying to you here. If we go to drafts here, well, funny enough, I actually have this hidden from my picker because I didn't want to show all the different drafts. So let me just what can I do? I can do this. Okay, let's go drafts, and then we'll just say index.markdown, super specific. I'll enable hidden files for now. Well, you can see one of my drafts now. I guess I'll blur that one. It's not a big deal, but anyways, like, this is what I have here. And I even threw out a to-do for myself because, well, I don't know. This is maybe something I thought about in the past. But, you can see build, render, never, cascade, type, draft. And if we go to the blog post over here, we have build, render, never, cascade, type, draft. And then, yeah, these are basically what these are. Actually, I don't even know why I showed it to you in the code editor. It's even easier just to look at it here. So in any case, we have build and we have cascade. And these are properties that you can put into your front matter. And what's really cool about this is, well, one, I guess start with the build one, right? We can just say render never. So this is actually going to instruct Hugo not to render the index page for the drafts. So if I were to take this URL and just pop it in here, then it is going to 404 because it didn't get built. It didn't get rendered. Why? Because we have render never. If you did want to have your drafts in a separate URL namespace, you can totally do that. Just don't set that to never and you'd be good to go. Then this cascading feature is super handy. We're actually saying now to Hugo, by the way, we have this one content type called blog. Just make all the drafts a blog. There you go. And then also while we're here, let's also make them all drafts. So then what we end up is this really nice solution where, yeah, if you take a look here at the directory structure for Hugo that I have set up, like what are drafts then? Well, drafts are just another type of content and all my drafts are here. All my blog posts are there. And that's it. That's all I need to do to get that to work. And I think that is like really, really super handy to separate your stuff out with, a pretty surprisingly small amount of code to get it to work. And also pretty super flexible because you can tweak any of this stuff depending on what you want to do. And yeah, if it's not clear, like Cascade is going to apply all these to every single post that you have for the thing. So yeah, that avoids us needing to put draft true in every single draft that we have. So yeah, when you're writing a draft or a blog post, like nothing changes. Like it's just a blog post, right? And then the really nice thing there is when you're ready to promote your post from a draft to like a live post, then yeah, you just move the file from a draft to blog and you're good to go. That's it. Just moving the file is the action to make it a post. And yeah, when you build your site development, in development, you can include drafts. And then in production, when you build your live site, you just don't include them. So yeah, your drafts don't get included. So it's perfect, basically. And even when you're looping over your blog posts, it will mix them both together because, from Hugo's point of view, like a draft is just a type blog. So like they are the same. You can, again, keep them separate if you want. But yeah, by default, things will just work. And yeah, Jekyll did this as well, which is pretty cool. So yeah, when you're building your site in production, like you just wouldn't include drafts and you wouldn't include future posts there. And you're done, basically. So Now let's talk a little bit about removing that trailing slash from the URL. So Jekyll was pretty great in this regard. It was super easy to choose if you wanted to have a trailing slash or not, just based on how you organize the different files that you had. So for example, if you had a hello.yaml file like in the root of your project, then it wouldn't get a trailing slash. But if you made a hello directory and put an index.html in there, then it actually would get a trailing slash. So how does that relate to this? Well, here's the Jekyll version of my site here. I have like an about page here, about markdown or whatever. This would not get a trailing slash. But if I went to the blog post, directory here, this index here, so if you went to /blog, that would actually be /blog/. Why? Because we have the directory with the index file. But yeah, Hugo does not work that way. And in Hugo, basically, as we mentioned before, we can basically configure URLs to be, or ugly URLs to be true or false. If true, then you get hello.html, else false, you get the pretty version, but it's always going to have that trailing slash. So then it's like, well, how do you work around that one? And, I couldn't find anything on the internet. Literally had to just use my brain to figure out a solution because I really wanted this. So what you could do is, and this is what I ended up doing here, I actually overrode the rel and refrel shortcodes. Is it refrel or relref? I always forget. That's one thing I don't like about Hugo. Is it refrel or is it relref? It's relref. Okay, so did I actually put relref here? I don't think I did. No, it's reversed. So yeah, I'll have to fix that one later. So that really should be relref. But in any case, what you could do, these are shortcodes created by Hugo. And really it boils down to this one. If you actually just trim the trailing slash using a function of Go's templating language here with Hugo, like this basically, then you're done. So here's what I ended up doing. So let's go to the ref shortcode here. We'll just take a look at it. Here, I just overrode it. This is normally what the shortcode does. And I just said, you know what? Let's actually just also remove the trailing slash from the URLs there. So what this really means is anytime I link to a link in my site, like if I'm cross-linking to something else or whatever, just linking somewhere, and I use rel or relref, then yeah, we're not going to end up with a trailing slash. Now, what's funny though is Hugo server in development, no matter what you do, it's always going to redirect to the version with a trailing slash. That's why we have a trailing slash over here. So let me just make sure this is, I'm going to remove those headers there. But yeah, let me now find where we were. Sorry. Where were we? We were over here, just about. Yeah. So you can see though, there's a trailing slash no matter what. Like Hugo server is just going to do that. But the really good news is Nginx is not. So in development, I don't really care if there's a trailing slash here, but in production with Nginx, yeah, there's not going to be a trailing slash because the file literally gets generated with no trailing slash there. So it actually is perfect in my case. I don't want trailing slashes. We're not going to have any 301 redirects and we're good to go. Now in my case, I did used to have, blog with a trailing slash on my main site, but just for consistency's sake, I decided to remove that. So I ended up configuring Nginx with one redirect, a 301 redirect that just redirects, blog with a trailing slash without it there. And then, this way old links continue to work here. So, if I actually go to the live version of my site here and we go to it with the /, then it gets redirected to it without the /. So I'm pretty happy with that. And yeah, all the blog posts, there's no redirecting happening. So I would totally consider that a victory. But yeah, okay. So custom digested file names. So this is all handled by Jekyll assets, right? And, going back to what we had before, it was filename-digest.extension. So, hello.jpg would become hello- and then, whatever SHA or whatever would be there and then your extension. Cool. All right. So Hugo, there's this thing called fingerprinting. So it's actually built into Hugo itself, and you can do, resources that get. That's, a feature they have to be able to look up a specific asset that you have. And then you can just run fingerprint on that function here. And again, it can't be a static file. It needs to be an asset. So if you're wondering why fingerprint isn't available on static files, they're just not. But yeah, the problem here is by default, it is going to use this format where you have filename.digest.extension. And we really want that dash there to be instead, like it can't be a dot because then we're going to have to 301 redirect a million different files and that's not going to work for us. So what do? Well, there actually is, at least at the moment of making this video here, no way to customize that delimiter. I really want to use dash, not dot. So I opened an issue about this one and, I explained the problem, proposed solution, all that stuff here. At some point, the creator of Hugo was like, okay, cool, I'm going to do this in the next version. But then, he just decided no, and then it became unscheduled. Now, the good news is, I was able to solve this one with the help of the community. And the bad news is you need to put it into every project that you have. But the good news is, unless you're migrating your site and you specifically have a different like asset digesting format, you don't even need it because you can just use the default one from Hugo and then you're going to be fine. So don't even feel like you need to do this. I need to do it because I didn't want to, 301 redirect all those images there. And we're not going to go over this in gory detail, but the good news is all the complexity is rolled up into a single file. So I basically have this image that HTML partial. So if we go and take a quick peek at this one, this one here, that's what it is. We're not going to go over any of it here, but what this really boils down to allowing us to do is, in fact, it's going to be explained better here, I'm pretty sure. In all the markdown files that we have, when we want to reference an image or layouts, by the way, we can just do this shortcode for image, put in the path to the image, and it is going to produce this, where it even will get the height and the width and put in an alt tag if you want. And then, yeah, you can see it's going to be digested the way we want with the dash and then also, the digest.extension. And that's all handled in this code here. And it works very nicely. And what's really cool about this one is, let's say Hugo author changes his mind. He wants to add this feature into Hugo itself. Well, all the markdown and layout files that you have, they don't need to change. They're just going to call the same exact partial. And then in your image.html partial, instead of doing all of this here, you can just like pass it through the regular fingerprint function that you have. Like in this case, I'm doing more stuff too. Like I want to get the default width and height and all this other stuff. I want that custom behavior. That's not like built into fingerprinting. But yeah, a lot of this logic here can just go away and get replaced in one spot whenever that feature becomes available. So it's a really good compromise in my opinion here. Nothing really needs to change once that, or if that even becomes a feature in the future. So yeah, all that logic around copying, calculating, blah, 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 it could potentially go away. But for now, really, it's not too bad, right? The complexity is contained in one file and its implementation can change without affecting other stuff. Cool. Basically good software design in my opinion. So I just wanted to mention here for starting a new blog today, I wouldn't worry about any of it. I would still want to have this stuff in a partial, but I wouldn't bother with the fingerprinting custom stuff. I would just use the default there. Now let's talk a little bit about syntax highlighting, right? I have Jekyll configured to use the Rouge highlighter here, open source project here. And all I really had to do was find a specific theme CSS file, dropped it into my project, and it's basically compatible with any Pigments theme too, which is pretty cool. Hugo uses things called Chroma or whatever. It also makes it very easy to pick an existing style. For example, in your Hugo configuration, you can just do markup highlight style and then pick whatever theme that you want to have. We're literally looking at the Monakai light theme here. That's what that is. Now, the problem though is that this theme by default, at least the version of Hugo and everything that I had, it didn't highlight the $ and the pound characters correctly. They ended up having like a really dark red text, which looked horrible with the theme here. So basically I had to customize it. And if you need to ever customize your theme at Hugo, these are some of the steps that you can do. One, you want to generate your Chroma style for the specific theme that you want to customize. This is going to produce a whole bunch of stuff, copy it to your clipboard. You could paste the contents into an existing maybe style sheet that you have, like an app.css file. Then check your pages, right? For the classes that you need to be overriding, like for example, the ones associated with these characters here. In my case, it was the error class. And by the way, we're going to look at some code in a second here. Yeah, then you just update the colors to what you want here. And then you add no class is false as a new config option under this. And we're going to show that in a second here. That just tells Hugo to use your custom CSS instead of the one like that's over here. So let's start with that config file first and just go to config. And then I think it's default. And then the Monakai one should be somewhere down here. Yeah, you can see that I just put no class is false. That's what we just chatted about here. Still markup highlighting here. And yeah, if we go to the app.css file, all the way down here, this was the big thing that I copied to my clipboard, all of this essentially. And then, yeah, I just found the error class one, which I guess is going to be this one. And I just changed the color to be what I wanted it to be because by default, it was like just really bad looking in my opinion. So yeah, that was it. I just literally customized that one line. Everything else is the default of what I copied to my clipboard from the output of this generate command here. And yeah, this will work for any theme here. There's a whole bunch of different styles that you can choose from. I'm not going to go into them in the video here, but yeah, they're just available to use if you'd like. Or you can just make your own theme. It's also up to you. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some assorted template functions here. I don't want to include too many basic examples, but here's a few like, I don't know, feature-oriented ones, like things you might want to put on your post as well. For example, on the homepage, going back to here, we can go and see the latest 12 posts, right? So there's like 3 through 3 up until that. So we have like 4 rows of 3 columns. So we have 12. And yeah, the way I did this one is I actually use a clear fix div to every 3 entries just to make sure they're broken up into 3 columns. Again, like I don't want to really have to redo too much here. I know this problem can now be solved with CSS. It wasn't solvable with CSS, I don't think 10 years ago. So I used the clear fix solution here because I was using Bootstrap like version 3 or whatever the heck was being used back then. So in Jekyll, what I had here was this little for loop, right? We're going to go over all the different posts here, limit them to be 12 because we just want 12 of them back here. And then, yeah, we are just going to output our columns right over here. But, every time we get to one that's divisible by 3, then we're just going to add this clear fix here. So we end up with like post, 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 new row, post, 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 new row, post, 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 new row. And that's exactly what we see here. Post, 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 new row, blah, 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 blah. We have the clear fix in there being inserted. And not too crazy, seems pretty straightforward, I guess, to do such a thing. Again, could be done in CSS now. So in Hugo, here is the solution. I'm going to keep both on screen, I guess, so you can see both. So you can see already the syntax is a little bit more wild with Ghost templating language, but it's basically the same thing. We're just going to go through all the different content types at our blog. They're going to be sorted by file because, again, another benefit of year, month, day, they're going to be sorted in the way that we want in a consistent way. And then we're just going to actually get the first 12. So that's actually wrapped on 2 lines because I'm zoomed in so much, but really that's, it's 12. And then literally this basically the same thing where, post, 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 and then we're going to do our clear fix here and, repeat it until we're done. But, one of the really interesting differences here is Liquid's loop index starts at 1 and Go's actually starts at 0. So here we can see the index where, I just overrode that to be 1 because initially, if this value is 0, holy cow, did things not look the way they should be. I wasn't getting anywhere near the results I wanted to see. So takeaway here is, seeing what a value is pretty much a cheat code, right? So as soon as I printed the loop's index, which, you can just print here in the loop here, I immediately saw what was happening and I just had to add 1 to the index here. And then I was good to go here. And by the way, the above code snippet, just shows how to get the latest 12 post here. And again, I mentioned here explicitly file path because we have them prefixed like that, which means they're all going to be naturally sorted, super easy to do. Now, let's go with dealing with apostrophes and plus symbols here. So while testing the output of both tools, I actually noticed that Jekyll outputs a regular apostrophe, regular double quotes, and other symbols here when you're dealing with something like the title or the meta description. However, with Hugo, it used the ASCII code, such as like, ampersand #39 for a single quote here or whatever. But keep in mind, this was only in the page's source code. So for example, if we go to, let's just say this blog post, because it does happen to have an apostrophe. So just by luck, by the way, let's go to the page source and take a look at the title. Where are we going to find the title? Somewhere down here. It's going to be really mixed in this one line. So let's just do Control F for title, I suppose. And then we take a look at this, then we can see that it is a single apostrophe now because I did stuff to do that. But by default, that would have shown that instead. And, in the browser's title here, it was being showed correctly, like just, literally an apostrophe. Also in the browser's title here, it was being shown with an apostrophe. It was only being shown like this in the actual source code. But given how important your meta description and your title are, I didn't want to mess with anything for SEO purposes, right? Because a crawler is going to be looking at the title tag in the HTML. And if the HTML has that instead of that, like what could happen? I don't know. I didn't want to have to mess with it. I do know this though, that, every big site that I looked at, I don't look at all of them, but, like GitHub and Twitter and blah, 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 they were not doing this. They were doing that. So I just wanted to make sure that I output the real character as well. It turned out to be really tricky to solve. And, the docs mentioned like, oh, you can just like pipe it into safe HTML and it's going to work, right? But no, that still didn't actually work. So instead, what you have to do is that you have to use printf here. And maybe there's other ways to do it, but this is how I figured it out to work. Again, like I asked some people in the forums and some other stuff, but you just printf whatever variable that you want, and then you pipe it into safe HTML, and then it works. I guess maybe this is related to something with Go's templating parsing. I didn't really dive into it too hard, but you could see already like how big of a pain this actually was, because like to get that to work for the meta description, like you had to use a whole different other strategy as well. But although in this case, I'm doing other things that are unrelated to fixing that apostrophe, but like printf with like a content queue, like my God, it took like, this is one of those things where it took like 3 hours to get a working solution for something that was like just built into Jekyll. But whatever it is, maybe there's a better reason for this that I just don't know. But in any case here, Chomp is going to get rid of trailing new lines because, I like to have, as you can see here in the front matter, if I go to, I don't know, any post from 20, whatever, you can see that I have my description actually with a hard line break here because I just like for it to be less than 80 characters in my code editor, but I don't want the hard line break to be in the actual description. By the way, this gets used as the meta description as well. But yeah, so in this case, I just chomp out that thing. And then also, we get rid of some HTML tags if they happen to exist, because they could, in some cases, maybe I have a link that I actually want to be linked here, for example, because this is also displayed from that description. Maybe if that were a link, I would want the link here, but I wouldn't want that link in the actual meta description. So long story short, just cleaning up the thing there. And yeah, this basically just goes into all that here. And then yeah, this is a solution to get that to work if you want here. But yeah, now both of those problems are solved there, which is pretty cool. So now let's talk a little bit about more of the fun ones, like just how content was displayed differently depending on what you were doing. And, I did thankfully catch all of these before I pushed them to live, but like some of these were pretty unexpected changes that I had to make because, yeah, just details that you might not be aware of. For example, if you have a markdown file, and it looked like this or like this, Jekyll will actually treat both of these as being the same. And, the difference here is there is an extra new line break between, the paragraph here and the opening div. And if you were to do this with Jekyll, then, you would just get the content like, and then it's going to be wrapped in a paragraph tag, like inside of a div. But Hugo is actually going to render the second example pretty differently. So it is literally going to output like open bracket, P, close bracket, and ultimately, why? Because it's going to end up wrapping this in a pre-tag instead of like, actually processing that as a paragraph here. And technically, that does adhere to the common mark spec because this happened to have like 4 leading spaces here. And I don't know, the specification, like it's correct from the specifications point of view, but it was unexpected, at least to me, because like I didn't have the common mark spec memorized and like Jekyll just like auto-magically handled that for you. Now, does that mean Jekyll is better than Hugo in this case because it handled that? I don't know. You can make a case maybe the Hugo version is better because it's more explicit and it sticks to the spec, so it's more predictable. Maybe. In fact, I actually maybe agree with that. Like, I think it's better that your code is correct for the intent that you want to do. So I actually do like that. But, in any case, what it means is like, I just was spot checking some posts and I found that and I'm like, what the heck is going on? And then again, just like diffing the differences of things, I'm like, oh, let me just try removing that space and see what happens. Oh, cool. Now it works the same. So then I just wrote this little grep regex here to help me find situations there. And yeah, it's going to find a whole bunch of different false positives, but it was good enough to just manually run through them in a few minutes and fix the ones. Like I had a handful of posts that needed to be adjusted. So thankfully that was a pretty easy fix there, but realized like I had to know this was even a problem first. And another interesting one, and again, by the way, all of this is based on the version of Hugo that I used at the time, which was like version 1.130 or something. I'll show, we'll get to there eventually, when we get to the bottom of the post. But yeah, with Jekyll, I had a whole bunch of lists that were set up like this with like nested lists. So you might have something like, a numbered list, like 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then you have a nested list. So like space, space, and then your nest, space, space, and your nest. And that would output something that would look like this, right? You have your numbered list, and then you have like, space, space, and the thing. And then, but in Hugo, if I took that exact same code and put that in there, then it actually just produced this. Like, where is the indentation there? And I don't know, I guess apparently the fix was to use 4 spaces instead of 2. And it gets a lot more fun too, because a long time ago, or I don't know when this was, I made this one blog post about 120 different skills I use as like an SRE, such platforms, as develop, whatever, this type of thing. And I had over 100 different items in here. And you can see a common pattern here is basically numbered list with a sub, like a nested list in there. But, there's like how many? 125 of them. But yeah, the interesting thing here was if you happen to have over 100 items in your numbered list, then if you use 4 spaces, you end up with that. So it just gets pulled up to basically the same line instead of being like a sub item there. So the fix there is if you have 100 or more items, you actually need to use 6 spaces instead of 4, which now starts to become like, man, that's a lot of things to keep track of mentally. And like, how would you even know that exists beforehand? Was a really annoying one to find with grep too. So I just ended up looking for all the different posts with any form of list with that pattern. And like, I just spent the half an hour and went through like 500 posts or whatever the results were to make sure it worked. And yeah, I mean, just going back to here, if we go to that SRE post, SRE 120 skills, like if you look down here, you know, I actually have 6 spaces here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces there. And then there it is. And you know, the ones that are before 100, you can see I have 4 of them. And if I didn't do that, then yeah, it would just get pulled up. And yeah, that was a wild one to figure out, but yep. Okay, cool. So that's good now. And then also we have this idea of like blog tags. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of different ways to implement tags in Jekyll. And you can totally do this in Hugo too. This one wasn't a problem at all. But, you know, in both cases, I basically, in my frontmatter, wanted to be able to say tags and then pop in a list of tags here. And, you know, that's what I did previously in Jekyll. And, you know, I wrote some little bit of logic to handle outputting that. With Hugo, you can create these things called taxonomies here. And, you know, what that really means is basically having a content type of a tag. And then you have this index.markdown file there. And then, you know, you can have your specific tag related files inside of that content there. So for example, you have something for Docker or for Flask or for Vim or whatever tags that you have. And, you know, if you take a look here at the content tags Docker index.markdown file, that just has this basically, where you have the slug of the tag, the title, the description that you want, and whatever the title that you want displayed. So this is more specific on how I wanted things set up. So like, for example, if you go to the main site here, and then I go to blog, and then we go to Docker, we can see it actually says Docker tips, tricks, and tutorials, and that's the name of the URL. And then we also have this, you know, description here as well. And yeah, but if you go to here and we actually output all these different tags, it actually just says Docker there. It doesn't say Docker tips, tricks, and tutorials. So going back to here, you know, I have this, like the title ends up being literally like what the tag is, but then we have this idea of like a hero title, and that would be like what you see here. So I just wanted a way to make those different. So that's why I introduced that as a thing. And then, yeah, there's a description and there's a slug, which is the URL, because I didn't want the URL to be the matching title, because that's what it will by default. Like it would be, you know, tag/Docker, but really what I wanted was tag/ you know, Docker tips, tricks, and tutorials. So in Hugo's config file, I just have taxonomies there to be tagged because, or should be, sorry, let me rephrase. In the taxonomies config, I have tags set to be tags, because if you go here, you know, I want this to be singular, where you have blog/tag/ and then whatever. And yeah, that's just how you do that in Hugo. So now, yeah, you can actually visit that URL and it goes right to what you want. And it's the same way as I had it set up with Jekyll here. And then if we're displaying the tags, such as like the blog's index page, that page that we're just looking at over here, like what we see here, then yeah, I just have this little loop here where you just loop over your taxonomy, basically your tags there, and then you can output them whatever formats that you want here. And then also, I also have this too, I should mention, where, you know, if you were to click into, let's say, this post here, then this has a couple of different tags, right? For Docker, for Flask, for JavaScript or Rails or whatever. And yeah, that's also just done by this type of range here, where you can just get your tags here from terms, and then you can do whatever you need to do to output whatever you want. So not too crazy, but also required pulling together quite a few little things here. Now let's talk a little bit about data files here, such as having a YAML file that you can loop over and then do whatever you want in whatever templates that you have. For example, if we go and take a look here, let me get rid of some of these tabs here. If we go to the courses here, I have a couple of different courses available, and you know, there's a common structure to these. Like this is being rendered from a YAML data file in Jekyll and in Hugo. So you have a title, like an image, a description, a link, like, you know, some testimonial, and then, you know, it just repeats that for every course that I have. And yeah, that's all done with a structure that looks very similar to that. In fact, we can actually take a look at it. There's nothing hidden or crazy that I wouldn't want to show. So it's just a data YAML file. Like there's a course, there's a URL, you know, the image, like the synopsis or whatever, testimonial, and then it just repeats. There's the one for Flask. There's the one for this. Like yeah, it's a nice consistent data structure. And then, yeah, let's go back to here. And really what all you had to do there was just loop over your data. So in this case here with Jekyll, you know, the syntax would be, you know, for a course, like whatever item that you have, right, in your site data courses. And again, like we go to the Jekyll version of this, we can go to site courses here, or actually I should just put courses here. or actually I should just put course here, whatever, here it is. But yeah, inside of this data directory, we have, I had some other stuff with Jekyll there too, but yeah, very similar, right? It's just a YAML file with this. I literally copy pasted that and, change some things around, whatever, but it's like basically the same thing. And yeah, with Hugo or Go specifically, to do the same type of loop, then you just say, there's your range there, and then there's your item, and your item just comes from whatever, data you have. In this case, it's courses, but it could be other things as well. Now, where it gets really tricky with Hugo is when you want to dynamically pull out a specific entry from the data file based on a variable such as a page's slug. So what does that actually mean? If I do a search here for galleries, that should probably give us an example of what we want. So let me do a search for galleries. Here is galleries here, and let's go back to the blog post here where, yeah, page.slug. It basically, we need to look for this line in the code base. So let's go and do a search for, let's go to galleries, which is this one. Is this the dynamic one? That's the dynamic one, sorry. But in any case here, we want to get this specific thing dynamically based on the slug being passed in. So if we go to here and then we go to galleries on the main site over here, galleries, sure. We want to go to the Boston gallery and you can see what gallery are we doing? Well, the Boston one, but this needs to be dynamically read from that YAML file. So we need to basically say, yes, that's the one that we want from the slug. But this syntax was super alien to me. This is one of those things that took an hour just to figure out the syntax to get that to work. Whereas with the Jekyll one, it was just I don't know if you know Ruby, it's just it's pretty easy. You just do your little loop and then it's oh, square brackets. And then the thing's a variable, when you read into that dictionary thing. But yeah, again, I'm not talking trash about Go's templating language, but it's it was new to me because I don't really develop with Go. And I just found the syntax to be a lot different than what I thought it would need to be, but it worked in the way that it needed to work in the end. But yeah, this was a painful one a little bit. I also notice here too, that should be double squigglies there. I'm going to fix that as well. Cool. Okay. And I don't even know where I found that, by the way. I don't even think I just came up with that. I'm pretty sure I was on page 17 of Google and then I was didn't find anything. So I just went to GitHub issues and I searched there. And then I found maybe a code snippet somewhere from someone wanting to do that. But yeah, happy to know that that actually works now. Moving on, pagination. This is not worth going over, I don't think. I mean, there's extensive documentation for Jekyll and Hugo. This was super painless to get going. No problem really whatsoever there. Then there's this idea of render hooks in Hugo, which are pretty interesting. This is going to help us do that, target blank that we wanted to do on the links there. But yeah, hooks can basically be used to adjust the output of rendering Markdown to HTML. So I use them to solve two problems here. One is opening those external links there in a new window, and also to add named anchors for the headings. So for example, if I go to, let's go to the other one, I don't know, one of the blog posts here, it doesn't matter which one, these over here. So it's this is being generated automatically. I don't have to worry about ever putting in my Markdown files links to that to make that work. And that all is being done through hooks. And we're going to go over both of them here. So yeah, big caveat here though, is this only applies to Markdown content, right? If you have links in your layouts, those are not going to get the hooks applied. So, I had that one Jekyll plugin for the external links. That just worked everywhere because the plugin processed everything. It didn't matter where it came from. I wish I can do something with that with Hugo. I couldn't find a solution to do that. It's not the end of the world, right? Because 98% of my links are in those Markdown files. So in the layout files that I have with Hugo, I just, manually added those external links as needed. There was maybe two of them. It wasn't really a big deal, but it's something now you need to mentally manually remember to change if you make modifications to your layouts, right? But yeah, to get that external links to work there, Hugo has a link hook. So all you have to do is create this one layout, default, markup, render. And by the way, this is a very important, these need to be named this, by the way. And then yeah, basically you just do whatever the default link does, but then you also then add your own custom logic to do what you need to do. So in this case, I basically just say, if it's an external link, then let's add the target blank here to be this. So, you could be $U, is the URL being passed in. And then, yeah, if it's just, absolute and it's not the base URL of the site, then yeah, then we go and just add that. And the base URL is something you configure. So for example, going back to the configs over here, config this one, the base URL, then yeah, I mean, on my local version, when I'm running Hugo locally, then it's localhost, but in the production version, then it is going to be this one. So if we go to config, then we go to production, then it's going to be that. So if it's not that, then it gets the target blank as long as it's absolute. That's it. Super, not too crazy, but works out pretty nice. So yeah, I mostly grabbed that from the documentation. I think there may have been even an example for this directly. But yeah, I won't bother posting the Jekyll solution there because it was a custom plugin and it would be a while to go over all that code. But yeah, maybe we're not even doing that, so it wouldn't matter. But yeah, this is how you could do it if you want, if you're using Hugo. Cool. And by the way, that Jekyll plugin, yeah, just parsed HTML using Nokogiri, which is like a really popular HTML parsing library. And then basically I just went through, got all the links, and then yeah, just compared them against a list like this in a similar way, and then added target blank as needed. Then we have the named anchors. We went over that a second ago, like this type of thing. And yeah, when you're making some type of content-oriented site, it's super nice to make it really easy to link to other people, like a specific header of a blog post. Like, this blog post is 10,000 words long. It's nice to be able to like link you directly to, one of these headers up here, I guess, right? Well, I guess we'll get into this where I only have them being on H3s, not H4s or below, but yeah, these are all H4s that you're seeing here, I suppose. But okay. Let's go back to where we were a second ago. So yeah, I just mentioned that over here. Cool. So you can do a hook for a heading as well. So, in this default markup render heading, you can just do something like this. Now you can make this happen on all the different headings if you want. Actually, heck, let's get crazy and do it right now live just to see how it works. So let's go to render heading.html. All right, let's go to render heading HTML. And instead of, if equal to level 3, let's just get rid of that if condition entirely. And yeah, I don't have auto formatting set up on this, but yeah, all right, let's go and do that and then go back to here. And then it's like, cool, parse failed, unexpected else. All right, so I have an else that needs to go away. Yep, that needs to go away as well because we don't need that. And then we go back to here and unexpected else, really? Oh, I think this is an interesting takeaway with Hugo. I think if there's syntax error like that, you actually end up needing to restart the Hugo server. So let me restart that. And then I'll just run watch, and then we'll go back to here. So review the code to make sure it is correct. I don't even know, but I think it might be. So let's go back to here and check it out. So now if we go back to here, then Hugo by default is not going to add these to all the different headers, but it will add them to, here's an H3, cool, that was added. And I'm pretty sure, yeah, this is an H4. Let's confirm that. So let's go to inspect. Super insanely small. Okay, well, you can probably see maybe now that is an H4. So it is being added by Hugo there. And, I just don't have any H2s and H1s, so they're just not, you're not going to see those. But yeah, this is actually working pretty nicely. So let's go back to here, add our else condition and add our if level 3, because that's what we want. We don't want all the levels. So if we go back to here, then yeah, just reloaded. Then we go back to here, there's our H3, but this was an H4, no longer has it. So yeah, it's super easy. Let's go back to where we were before. That was a fun little side quest. And how far are we along here? Blog tags, we did that. Let's go back to external links, named anchors, cool. So this is where we were. Super easy to add that, right? And nice little code, which basically just says, you know what? If we are dealing with a header level that is 3, like equals 3, specifically 3, I mean, here's the else condition, right? Like just do what a normal H3 would do, which is basically just output your text there. And the level is something provided by Hugo, by the way. Like this will be 2 or 3 or whatever it is. But yeah, if we're dealing with an H3, then we actually just add this one anchor there. And then it also just outputs the link. And then also, there's the header as well. So everything works pretty nicely. We don't need to worry about it. I actually used a little bit of absolute positioning here because I wanted this thing to sort of just like float off the layout, right? Like I want it to be a little bit wider than the normal layout, but that's just like CSS stuff that I had a preference for. And that's it. That's it. Then you have it. Then you can just write your normal header like that. And then that's automatically going to be converted into something that just works. So if we go back to here to one of these blog posts, let's just say, I don't know, let me just find one. Doesn't really matter what it is. You could see like there's an H5 or whatever, but if you could find one that has like an H3, I don't know which one's going to be long. Like the Docker Summit one is probably going to be insanely long. I mean, it's going to have an H3, but yeah, you can see right there. That's all I had to write just to get that to work. So that's pretty cool. All right, so let's go back to here. And yeah, in Jekyll, I did this in a much worse way. it sort of combos with the idea of creating the quick jump table, which is coming up next here. So let's just, not talk about that until we need to. But yeah, the table of contents, right? In Jekyll, I combine this idea of like named anchors and the quick jump feature together. And in the front matter, basically, well, this is something I implemented a year after I started my blog. So we're talking like in 2015. I didn't really think it through in the best way possible. It worked for 10 years, but I never really thought to change it. But man, it was like not the prettiest thing. So in the front matter, I basically have table of contents defined, and then every header in order is defined in that table of contents. Then I just in my layout file for the blog or whatever, I would just loop through those and then output them. But every single markdown file that I had to do this, where it was like, here's the H3 that I want, but let me read from the page's talk, which would be this, which would be index 0 or index 1. And I'd have to like literally copy paste this, like, the actual anchor point, make sure it aligns to the right thing, slugify it. And then every single post had that. So like if I went to here and I went to, did I even write this post? Yeah, I didn't. Let me see. Posts. I'm just trying to find like Docker Summit. I don't know. So we can look at the same thing. I guess I didn't. Yeah, you know what? I think the Summit might have been the first post I made in Hugo. So it was like, it wasn't even written with Jekyll. Yeah. All right. So it doesn't really matter. You get the idea. It was literally the syntax for every H3 that I had to do. And then I incrementally manually referenced the correct number. But yeah, it was a lot of copy pasting. It wasn't ideal because like, and this definitely happens when you're writing. If you want to reorder your titles, it's like suddenly I had to go back and like modify the index for each thing. Totally not the best. It could have been easier. Probably I could have just wrote a custom Jekyll plugin to do that. But really I wasn't even looking at the it wasn't until I looked at the Hugo solution to be like, oh, this could be solvable in like a much better way. But yeah, if I were to go back in time, I would definitely write a custom Jekyll plugin for that. But with Hugo, there is this built-in, like literally a table of contents that you can just do, which is going to output all of your headers in a list like that. And then, all I do there for the quick jump is basically just use CSS to style this specific ID. And also add that little pipe separator here too. So like if we go back to this one, there is a nice little CSS pipe separator between those two. So yeah, that's all CSS there to make that work. So this is pretty automated with Hugo. It really wasn't that crazy to do. But yeah, in my case here, there is no front matter for any table of contents. Like if we go back up to here, like I don't have a talk here. However, I do have an option to where you can put TOC true or false, like do you want it enabled or not? And it just defaults to true if it's not there. But yeah, this is really good because it allows me to skip generating the quick jump for pages that I don't want them on. Like for example, the about page doesn't have that. So I just put talk false on that page. And I could probably even optimize that more to be like, maybe look through to see if there's any H3s. And if there's not, then maybe just disable like not rendering it at all. Like, these are things that could maybe be done. But for now, just setting talk false on like the 3 pages that I need it seemed to work pretty well for me. And then it's also worth pointing out by default, Hugo configures the TOC there to start with H2 and also end with H3. My page layouts include also H1 and H2, but these don't get included in the talk, which is what I want. I just want them to be H3s basically there. And that's what we do. So yeah, you can read out actually how to customize the start and end ones here. There's like a whole page for this, where if you want those end levels and start levels to be different, then you can just do whatever you need to do. You can configure this, by the way. I didn't mention Hugo's configuration could be in YAML or TOML or JSON, not just the front matter, like the actual config. I just use YAML there as well, but yeah, you can choose to do that different if you'd like. So then we have things like the sitemap and the RSS feed. So for Jekyll, I just used the sitemap plugin, which is this one here. It worked very nicely. I don't know how well supported it is now, but like I never had a problem with it. It worked good. So, and Hugo will create a sitemap by default, which was nice, but I did have to customize quite a lot here to remove trailing slashes from the URLs. That involved creating this sitemap XML file here, grabbing like different values from GitHub and then doing that trim suffix feature that I did for that rel ref and those rel shortcodes there. I had to do the same thing in the sitemap.xml file. And, one noteworthy difference here, we'll take a look at this in a sec, by the way, is Jekyll, will include all the pagination pages. Like for example, like blog page 3, page 4, page 5 in the sitemap, but Hugo doesn't. Maybe it's debatable and if you should include them. I did research this quite a bit and it's like still pretty up in the fence. I think more people lean on not including that nowadays, but like, I couldn't find an easy way to include them with Hugo, so I actually just left them out. I didn't notice any difference here with my SEO. You know, this is one of those call outs where like 6 months later seemed to be okay. But yeah, let's go to the sitemap.xml file. Here, we're not going to go over this file in detail, but like I just wanted to show you that for all the links that were being generated in here, like I just like piped that into strings, trim suffix, just like we did before. And there's all sorts of different things in here. But yeah, literally what we're looking at, this whole entire file is it. There's not a lot in here. It's 20 lines of code to get this to work. And again, like Hugo has a, you know, we could have just used a built-in sitemap, but we wanted to override it to do these things. That was it basically. So next up we have the RSS feed. So I created a custom atom.xml file for both Jekyll and Hugo. This is basically, you know, if you went to nickjanethackis.com/atom.xml, then that would be a URL that's valid, which will return the RSS feed here. So I actually grabbed the default template from Hugo, made a couple little modifications to this one, but basically it loops over all the blog post, grabs the latest 25 entries, and the formatting and implementation of both of them, Jekyll and Hugo, are both the same. Of course, the template logic is going to be different. You know, if we go here and do a search for RSS, you know, this is it here. Yeah, the template highlighting is not very good with NeoVim because I didn't set it up correctly because I really don't modify this file a lot. I'll work on that one. But yeah, in this case here, it's a lot of default code that existed with Hugo, but then again, just doing some minor differences here where we want to do trim suffix, and then also just making sure we get the number of posts that we want, little modifications like that. And in fact, I'm actually going to go over a little run script tool that I wrote to help me compare what changed on Hugo versus what I have locally to see if I need to update my local version, which would be pretty handy. But yeah, really when it came to only including blog posts, I modified the default template to do this one because yeah, one difference here was I believe Hugo's default RSS feed included all the different content types. So like, you know, it would make one for courses and for all individual pages there. But in my case, yeah, I just wanted the blog. So I just put type blog there and then it only generates that for the blog. And yeah, worth pointing out 2 specific Hugo changes to make this the way that I wanted to. So I wanted to make sure Hugo outputs atom.xml because that's what I had with Jekyll. If other people had their RSS reader configured, I didn't want the file name to be, you know, like rss.xml or something else. Like it has to be named that. So I did this in my Hugo config file where, yeah, the output format for RSS, we just say, you know, the media type, it's an RSS, and then base name is atom. So it gets generated as atom.xml instead of rss.xml. Also worth pointing out by default, yeah, Hugo will create separate feeds for different sections of your site, right? You know, these can be taxonomies or sections or content pages. And I just wanted only one. So for the blog. So in that case, you know, if you want that behavior as well, then you can just, you know, set these outputs for the things that you want, or you can turn them off. So like, for example, for all the different taxonomies or sections that I have, or the terms or whatever, this is just going to output HTML. But for the home output here, it also includes the RSS. And, you know, this only generates a root RSS feed here and ignores generating files for the other ones. And I'll be honest with you, I wrote this 8 months ago. I don't know how home correlates to also including blog, but it just worked. So basically, my advice to you is like do something similar and it should just work if that's what you want to do here. Actually, let us know in the comments below if you see something more specific or can understand that a little bit better on why that includes blog there as well. Yeah, okay. So let's talk a little bit now about Twitter and YouTube embeds. So with Jekyll for Twitter, I was using this plugin here, which worked very well for about 10 years. You can see it hasn't been modified in a while, but like it still worked. And yeah, what basically that let you do is you can just, in your Jekyll code, you can just have, you know, Twitter, and then you just pop in the Twitter URL, you put in the user and then tweet ID there, basically the link to the specific tweet that you want to embed. And then with Hugo, there's a built-in shortcode where you can just do Twitter, and then you just put in the username for user, and then also the tweet ID for ID there. And by the way, this is an aside, but also interesting. Like to even be able to output something like that in Hugo, then you do need to wrap that in this. This is like some special magic comment syntax that literally the author made up, and he quoted basically this. So, you know, because Jekyll had this really nice idea where you can output raw, and then anything in there wouldn't be processed as liquid. So like you can just like, you know, if you wanted to output this literally instead of it being like, you know, interpolated, then you can just wrap it in a raw tag. But yeah, Hugo doesn't have anything like that. Instead, you got to wrap it with that. So to see what I mean about this one, let's do a quick search here and let's try to find a blog post that actually happens to have Twitter. Actually, you know what? No, it should be this blog post specifically. So the funny one about this one is, yeah, it is hidden. So when I do a search for this file, what can we do? Well, we can do this, and then I'll just do like 500. I'm pretty sure that should give us, well, hold on. What is the name of this post again? 500 page blog. So if I do a search for 500 page blog, and then I turn on hidden files, then yeah, there it is. So let's go to this one, and then let's just do a search for Twitter. Where was this? All the way down here. Yeah. So long story short, I should probably include a link to this one in the actual blog post. Like, not a link, but I should reference exactly how this was. So for me to literally be able to output what we saw in the browser, I had to add this magical comment inside the Go templating squiggly braces here. That's basically what that comes down to here. And yeah, I don't know. It was a little bit annoying to get that to work, I guess. But again, it was like Googling around and eventually finding that solution here. And by the way, there was this cool feature with Hugo's Twitter implementation is if the tweet that you have no longer exists because maybe someone deleted the tweet or maybe they made it private or whatever, then when you actually do your, Hugo command to start the server, it's going to show a warning to let you know that that tweet wasn't received. Now, the Jekyll plugin, instead, it actually cached the results to disk, and then it just read from that cache. So, you could theoretically have an old tweet from years ago that would still render correctly, but like if someone tried to click that link to go to the tweet, it wouldn't exist. So I actually like that it doesn't cache it with Hugo, and you actually get live feedback whether or not that tweet exists or not, which is pretty handy there. So yeah, with Jekyll for YouTube, I just took the embed code from YouTube there and turned it into an include to reference it. Basically, it looks similar to this here. And actually, I sort of lied in the post here just to make it a little bit more easier to demonstrate. As we saw before, it's actually embed.html and then you pass in YouTube there. So it wasn't really important to include that detail because literally it's the same thing here. It's just easier to digest there. But yeah, with Hugo, right, we went over this before. There's the built-in shortcode for YouTube there. And you can also customize this in different ways. There's all sorts of different stuff here if you want to do something different. I found the default to be pretty good, did exactly what I wanted to do there. And yeah, I have a whole bunch of different YouTube video embeds. Like I didn't want to have to update those by hand. So I just wrote a tiny little Python script to do this replacement here. And yeah, I just replaced the variable name so it fits on one line in the video here, or yeah, in the blog post, I should say. But all it really does in Python is just as a regular expression, replace. So it basically finds that, and then it just replaces using capture groups to do that. Now, I am doing two passes on there because one of them has single quotes, the other one has double quotes here because I had both variants in my Jekyll code. I don't really care. This is literally a one-off script that I ran to convert the whole blog, and it took like 1 second for the whole thing to run. I could have done like more or conditions to make that a little bit more efficient, but I don't really care. It works. But yeah, then I grepped both code bases there, and I basically made sure that the counts lined up for the number of each tag that I had to just, double check my work basically. And I will say this, there was a lot of that sort of thing here whenever I used Python, basically just doing stead to do some replacements or Python, and then like double checking my work with counts. And yeah, so speaking of double checking your work, I kept a running to-do list on what to check or convert. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but since I only started this list halfway through the migration, I removed a whole bunch of stuff that, this post already covered previously. But yeah, I feel like these are things that you might want to do on your site if you're about to do a major conversion between Jekyll and Hugo. So, I wanted to do everything in my power, right, to ensure nothing was different after the migration, unless I actually made an explicit decision for it to be different. So this means like, remove unnecessary white space in the content files, remove trailing new lines in content files, remove or replace the YouTube embeds there, right? Replace captures. This is actually a liquid feature to make more complicated variables. Hugo, as far as I know, didn't really have anything in a way to do that in a way that was like comparable to using captures with liquid, but yeah, it's not too big of a deal. I only had a few of those, but whatever. It's not even important to go over. But yeah, replacing image references from Jekyll assets to Hugo, replaced post URL to be relref because, this is the syntax that Jekyll used to basically make a link to a different page within your site. We want to make sure we don't have those dead links. So in Hugo, those had to be relref instead. Then it's like remove site.url. Again, that's like a Jekyll syntax there in favor of using relative URLs, whatever. It was basically something just to check into. We want to trim and chomp new lines where it makes sense, like those meta descriptions there. Remove trailing slashes from some of the URLs that had them, like, blog, courses, galleries, etc. Remove all the raw tags here because, that only exists in Jekyll. Also ensure all static files except robots.txt and some other things here too. Make sure they actually all exist, right? I don't want to have scenarios where files didn't exist after the migration. Then we want to make sure like the actual newsletter still works. There's nothing in Jekyll or Hugo that actually like powers the newsletter, but still like the syntax to wire up all the right forms and the IDs and everything. We want to make sure all that still continues to work. Then make sure the gallery images aren't digested. Make sure the discuss comments all work. And like if I go to an older post, then it actually pulls those up because, you know, the comment being pulled in from discuss, it actually like lines up to the title of the post. You know, that's another reason why maybe you wouldn't want those to change. Then maybe diff the sitemap to make sure it includes everything that I want. You know, make sure all the social sharing links still work for Twitter and LinkedIn and all this other stuff here too. You know, make sure those Twitter cards and open graph tags also work as well. And then here's a fun one too, like just confirm that the number of posts match in Hugo and Jekyll. If I have like 500 posts, then there should be 500 in Hugo as well, not 499 or whatever. And then also just double check that publish directory just to make sure that all the Hugo tags are processed. And you know, when it comes to something like quality control, you know, I use this as an opportunity to clean up all sorts of different inconsistencies over the years in all of my Jekyll posts there around formatting and stuff like that. Now, I didn't manually check every single page in the end there, but I spot checked a whole bunch. And, you know, after I ran those scripts there and it all looked good there, I didn't include most of the Python scripts and grep commands here in the blog post or even go over them in the video. It's just, honestly, it's too much. And a lot of it is so specific to this individual site that it really wouldn't give you a lot of value. So yeah, that's why I didn't include that here. You know, you might want to do something similar. If you actually have a specific question about how some of this works, like how I did some of these things, happy to, you know, answer all those questions in the comments below, either, you know, on the YouTube video or my site and discuss. So yeah, now let's talk maybe a little about, and this will have some code, maybe to talk about generating new YAML front matter. And it will have some code because I remember. But yeah, when you have 500 pages, like going back and manually updating the front matter to every single post, no way, man. Like that is too much to do. So my goal was to convert the Jekyll front matter that looks like this to the new front matter that looks like that in Hugo. So, you know, as mentioned before, we don't need the talk. Some stuff is going to be namespace a little bit different. You know, let's use consistent quoting all the way through. You know, here I had single quotes, there I have double, you know, stuff like that. And, you know, here's some of the improvements that you could do, right? Single versus double quote, make them consistent. The layout and talk fields, let's just remove them. We don't need them anymore. Top level fields are separated with new lines, like make it a little bit easier to skim, you know, stuff like that. And yeah, non-Hugo specific fields are namespace to params. Like for example, Hugo doesn't really know what a card is or an affiliate link. These are my custom things, but Hugo does know what a description and title are. So let's put the custom stuff in params there. And then, yeah, the card actually no longer needs to include a little bit extra in the path here. You know, the template, the layout file is actually going to put that there. So it's all in one spot. Whereas here, you know, again, like 9 years ago, I put that in there because maybe I thought like, oh, maybe I'll have a card from a different directory. Never did. So, you know, no need to put that there in every single blog card. Okay, cool. So a couple other changes too, such as changing field names from like bottom CTA, like call to action to newsletter. You know, I didn't really bother to include that up here. But yeah, here's some like actual Python code, zero dependency Python code that you can repurpose for your setup. You know, I've marked up the code with extra comments to really better explain it. So it's pretty basic stuff. I'm not going to go into all the details here. It's sort of kind of a lot, but not really. A lot of it's just like repeating the same thing for each different thing that we want to modify. But look, it's like we can just make a mini template for our new front matter, right? Literally multi-line string, and then we just make our own template language temporarily, right? Like if it's $ tags, we just string replace $ tags with whatever we want, and suddenly we have it, right? It really comes down to just like making some regular expressions, like detect front matter, cool. Where's the directory of posts? Right there. Nice. Let's loop over all of them. Make sure we get only the markdown files in there. Go and open each file, read it into a variable, and then it's like, here is just the details to be like, yeah, let's parse that front matter. And then like the get components of that, there's a tags, there's a bottom CTA. And yeah, I don't want to go over all the code here, but you know, it's here as well if you want to look at it in more detail. But it's like, yeah, let's just like replace that with this. And then there's a new one. Replace that with this. There's a new one. There's a card. There's a new one. And it's like, just do that in a loop until you're done. And you know, in this case here, the replace content would be whatever that is. So I did this for all 500 posts, and every single one of them was converted without a single issue. Every single one required 0 manual updates to work. And it was one of those times where like, I don't know, I spent like an hour or so making the script. It actually was worth it this time because it automated something that would have taken me like the whole day to do manually, and would have had like a million chances for a human mistake to happen. And yeah, what I ended up doing here was I just kept printing out new front matter instead of like actually replacing the file on disk, right? Until it was working. So as I was iterating on the script, building this up line by line, it was just like print the front new, or, you know, print the new front matter, print it, make sure it looks the way I want. And then once it was actually working, then it was like, yeah, then I actually just like replaced the file there. And that was it. So now let's talk a little bit about updating Hugo versions with confidence. So, you know, I was stuck on a really old version of Jekyll that I didn't change for many years there, but with Hugo, it's going to be a different story, right? I would imagine I'll update pretty frequently. And I have done that. I've updated a couple of times now. But, you know, while Hugo itself has a pretty extensive test suite, I felt pretty uneasy just updating to a newer version because you don't by default really have any insight on like what the output is of your site. You know, this is going to be like shipping a production application with no tests, right? Imagine you have 500 pages and you're using version 1, let's just say, and then you update to version 2 and now you output 500 pages. How the heck are you going to know that like everything was output the same? Maybe there's a bug in Hugo, maybe there's not, but like what could you do to like help protect yourself against that? So I've made videos about this in the past, this idea of a run script, and you know, it's a little shell script that you can just put into a project, and you know, I do like run publish to actually publish a new version of my site or whatever it happens to be. But here's what I ended up doing, and it's nothing to do with the run script, a little bit of shell script, basically just runs before I do the publish or whatever. But here's what I did. I just added a little bit of code there for the publish function, and it just says that, hey, if I want to make a backup, all I do is remove the old backup and then copy the publish directory, which by the way is the version of the site that Hugo produced, to the backup path, which is just going to be this, basically in the temp directory here. So now if I just run publish with -- backup, it is going to copy the final output to a temp directory. Now, let's say I update Hugo to a new version. I update to version 2. Then I just run publish without the backup flag. And then I can just run the diff command to diff the published directory that was just created to the temp directory, the old version. And then that's it. I can just see if these directories changed. And if there is a change there, then I can review it as a human. Maybe the change is for the better, maybe it compressed something differently, or maybe there's a bug in something, and now you can report it to Hugo to be like, hey, by the way, I just upgraded to Hugo, it's producing a different output, it's missing this thing, or whatever it happens to be. But you can think of this basically as one really big end-to-end test that's super fast. Like these builds take a couple of seconds. Yeah, now you can just look at the outputs there. So really, really, really gives me peace of mind that something didn't malfunction along the way there. And yeah, I've already updated quite a few times here over the last 6 months, and it's all been good. There haven't been any bugs or, you know, differences that I saw that were related to something that went wrong with Hugo. And by the way, earlier I mentioned that, you know, I kind of customize some of Hugo's templates, right? For the RSS feed and some other things as well, like the sitemap and pagination even as well. So what I ended up doing here was I locally copied a few Hugo pagination templates and RSS and sitemaps, etc., right? And I customized them. Now, I essentially now own these files, not from like a copyright or license perspective, but like they're in my code base, like they're my responsibility to keep updated. But let's say I update Hugo to a different version. How do I know that Hugo didn't change one of these templates? Like wouldn't be easy to detect manually. So what I ended up doing here was I just created a couple of new run script helpers for diffing things. So we can diff the pagination or the RSS or the sitemap, and it just takes in the local path to the file and where it exists in the GitHub repo for Hugo. And that's a remote URL up here. And then it's just going to, you know, this little helper function is going to diff those files for differences. And what it allows me to do here is just like, if I were to take this and just pop this into, let's go to, I don't know, maybe I'll just open up here and whatever, it doesn't matter. We can kill the Hugo server. We're not going to really be updating anything, I don't think. So, but if I just run this here, where we do run, and then we do diff, what was it called? Well, let's just do run, and we can do all the things. So we can just do run, diff, and then we'll just say pagination. Sure, let's go with that one. You can see it's diffing specific lines that happened here, which is fine. And if we take a look at some of these diffs though, it's like, what is really changing here? So most of it is really just like, well, the default template, the red, doesn't do the trim string thing here, right? But the other one, you know, all these basically boil down to that. Like these are all expected diffs that you would expect to see because, this changed to include trim suffix, and basically all of these are changing to do that. Some of the paths here are changing a little bit because Hugo did do this refactor where some of the paths change on stuff. So I would need to know now if I were to update to that newer version of Hugo that did the refactor, like these defines up here would also need to change. And yeah, it's very similar to like the sitemap. If we do diff on sitemap, then we can see like, oh, well, you had a permalink, but now it's with a trim suffix. And, there it is in a couple of different spots. So if I were to update to, and by the way, I should mention here too, when I do this, this is actually diffing against the master version of Hugo. You can also put in a custom tag to diff it against that if you'd like. So yeah, little things like this, little tools that kind of give you confidence to update things are super handy. I love little things like that here too. And this even goes over some example diff output here where it just shows to be like, yeah, well, now there's trim suffix on a couple of these things here. And yeah, if I see some expected changes, then I can see what I need to do, which is pretty nice here. And if I saw some new output, then, let's say that there's something cool, like a new interesting thing, I would know to go back to my template and then just add them back in. And by the way, here's a couple of different additional quality control things of 6 months of using Hugo here. Things I noticed basically, and some of them are pretty fun. Not really, well, one of them is definitely related to Hugo. The other one is not, but it's like, my SSD was getting pretty full. And, my dev box is over 10 years old, running WSL2 instance here, now running Arch Linux, by the way, which I'm going to do a video about. I just wanted to get this one out first. But yeah, in this case here, I was really, really low on disk space, and I ran out of disk space mid-build, but it seems that, at least at the point when I did this some time ago, Hugo will like build your site increment, like it's going to build and produce files in that published directory there. And if you run out of disk space while it's doing that, then you're going to end up in a scenario where, yeah, your output directory, your published directory, it's going to have a broken state because things are not going to be there. Like your site wasn't fully built. And you can imagine, like, I don't know, if your publish workflow includes building your site and then like pushing it somewhere, like if you have things set up like where you're not using error exit in your shell script or something, or maybe you did like an or true, so it's always successful, you can actually accidentally push a broken site to your live site, which would be pretty bad. So in my case, I just did a little bit of extra protection here to basically say like, look, if you don't have at least a gig available, then like just exit out and don't even bother even attempting to build the site. Because yeah, I have all sorts of different like gallery images and everything else. Like there's kind of like hundreds of megs of images or whatever. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I have at least a gig available before I'm even able to do that. And again, like since I'm dealing with WSL, like I have that mounted to /c, but you would replace this with whatever path that you want. You would replace that with however many kilobytes or whatever that you want to have as your minimum threshold. And then, yeah, it's just using the output of df there to basically say like, hey, by the way, if you've got less than a gig, then just exit out of here. So that gives me some confidence that at least, the box building the site will have enough disk space. The other one, this one really like internally hurt me a lot because it was very hard to figure out what was even going on. But Hugo will actually do parallel processing to build your site across all of your CPU cores by default. So, I only have an i5 3.2 gigahertz. There's actually 4 cores that you can take advantage of there. But you can imagine a better CPU might have like 16 or 12 or whatever. But in any case, Hugo is really good in the sense that like it will use your cores to build your site and it figures out like what it can build in parallel, I guess internally. I never looked at the code there. But I ran into a number of different race conditions here where I ended up having broken rel ref and rel links or ref links. Like the links were broken and like YouTube embeds were busted and like certain links were just like hard to even describe. It's like the link was not fully created. Like imagine just having like an A tag, but like, I don't know, the angled bracket wasn't closed. So it just like literally output like the link text without it actually being a link. But that's really, really bad. And this one was super scary because there's actually no warnings or errors thrown by Hugo. From its perspective, everything works successfully there. You could only notice it if you happen to go to a page where that output was happening, where this race condition occurred. And I was able to reproduce this quite a few times in development. And, I wasn't able to reproduce it consistently enough. So the author of Hugo didn't accept the bug report. And again, it's a race condition from parallel processing. It's a hard thing to reproduce. It's a problem though. So what I ended up doing was I just set an environment variable that Hugo allows you to do, which is num worker multiplier 1. So it basically just disables parallel processing. And it kind of blows because if you have a 12-core CPU or something, you want to use all 12 cores. But here's the good news. The good news is in development, if you get one of these problems, it doesn't matter. So in development, you can still have the super fast feedback loop. Just don't set that in development. But when you do your production build, then you do set it. And it still builds in like 5 seconds, 6 seconds, whatever it is, a production build on my machine. Even, I would imagine one core on a newer CPU is going to have a higher clock speed, so it'll be even faster. And yeah, as soon as I set this to 1, I had never, in hundreds of builds, seen a single problem. And the builds are already pretty fast here. So basically, I just added that. And in addition to doing this idea now sprung into my mind to be like, well, Hugo can build something successfully with no warnings or errors. Like, I don't want to ever have to really think about that. There's so many other ways things can go wrong. But what I ended up doing was I wrote these little grep checks here too as like, I don't know how to say, like extra precautions to protect against this specific problem. So, and again, these aren't perfect, but they've never triggered once, and I'm pretty confident now. So basically what happens here is you've got all these different paths that I want to check, all these different published paths, like where markdown files could be produced as HTML now, because in the published directory, it's just static files, no markdown is here, but like markdown was processed to produce these HTML files in all of these different directories. And here, it's just doing some grep to look for specific patterns in those files that I saw when things didn't work correctly. Like when a thing was just output partially, yeah, it matched one of these patterns here. And, in this case, if it does match one of those, then it's going to be like aborting. It won't even let me push the site. And thankfully, it hasn't happened yet. But yeah, I know it's not 100% foolproof. And I know like some of this stuff could be optimized better. But this runs in, again, like literally 20 milliseconds on 10-year-old hardware. So I don't care that I'm just running grep a few times. It's not a big deal. But yeah, in this case here, for the first couple of months of just building things, I did spot check at least like 20 pages per deploy, and I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Yeah, so that means like things seem to be okay. I haven't really thought about it now in the last like 4 or 5 months, but yeah, it's always something to think about. And I don't know, if you're finding some weird race conditions on your builds that you can't really reproduce, then yeah, consider setting this to maybe get around that one. But yeah, besides that though, maybe now let's talk a little bit about like, well, how do you actually switch your site from Jekyll to Hugo in a way that's like minimizes things that can go wrong, disaster recovery scenarios. Like if something goes crazy and you push it up and now you need to revert, can you revert in 1 second? Let's see. And this solution will let you do that. So what I ended up doing here was I synced everything to a separate directory on my server. So if you had a folder called like nickjetattackers.com or whatever, now it could be named hugo.nickjetattackers.com or something, like whatever, a different directory name. That's all it needs to be. I also created a separate Nginx virtual host file. Again, hugo.nickjetattackers.com. I made that actually a subdomain on my main site temporarily. This is so I could actually go to hugo.nickjetattackers.com just to make sure I can privately test things without touching my real site. So there's that as one thing. Like we're going to a different subdomain that isn't known to the world. I even disabled the robots.txt file in there so that, any crawlers wouldn't even attempt to even begin crawling it. And yeah, I even went as far as installing Nginx locally on my WSL2 instance just to test some of the redirect rules that I added, like, the blog one to remove the trailing slash there for, the index page of the blog. And by the way, I will mention here too, one difference with Hugo and pretty URLs, it generates an index.html file inside of a directory after your content. For example, in Jekyll, you would have something like in Hugo, you'll end up with blog/hello world/index.html, but in Jekyll, you'd actually end up with just blog/hello world.html. So the big difference here, right? Now you have a directory with an index file, whereas with Jekyll, you would just have the actual file named whatever that directory would have been with Hugo. And so to account for that at the Nginx level, Nginx has this one directive called try files. So here, I just do a URI/index.html. I put that first in the list there. And if it's not there in your example, then, you can put it there too. That means it's going to go and try to find this and then also that. So it's like, yeah, this will probably match first, and then it's going to fall back to that if it can't, and then fall back to that if it can't, and then fall back to that, and then give you a 404 if it can't find it in the end. But yeah, most of them are going to, match the first one, and then you're good to go. And once I was happy everything was working there, what I ended up doing was I backed up my original Nginx virtual host file, copied over the new one, and then renamed the server name, that's another Nginx directive here, to point to my root domain, which would be nextgenattackers.com. Like instead of being hugo.nj.com, it was just nj.com. And then I deleted the A record for Hugo, this one here, when I was happy that it was live, because this also led to very bad things. I don't think I ever made a video. Well, I already killed the server for that one, but whatever. There's this one time where I had a pretty bad event where, long story short, I'll link a description to that one, or I'll leave a link to the description of the blog post of that one if you want to check it out. But my God, if you ever have an A record on your domain, please delete it when you're not using it anymore. But yeah, at that point, I was live, and let's just say I found something really horrible and I wanted to revert. It really would have taken a second or two, because all I would have to do there is just switch the Nginx config to point to the original backup one instead of the one for Hugo. Because again, all the published files were in different directories, and Nginx is just picking a config to use for a specific domain. So yeah, it's pointing to a different Nginx config, reloading Nginx, and then you're good to go here. And fortunately, I didn't have to revert anything. Everything worked on the first try. And the only issue I'm aware of was, and again, this goes back to quality control stuff. I just didn't diff the Atom.xml file that I did for the sitemap. So like I diffed the sitemap, but not the Atom one. And, a reader of the blog actually emailed me right after everything went live, like the next day. And they were just like, hey, by the way, like all these new posts are being received by my RSS reader. Like what the heck happened here? And it turns out that the Hugo version includes all pages where Jekyll only included the last 25 blog posts. So you can imagine if you're in your RSS reader tool and now suddenly like my courses page, the about page, the work together page, the get updates page, all this stuff is now being like thrown at you. It just was not what I wanted. So yeah, then I just went back in there and I modified the RSS template to just basically include the last 25 blog posts, just like Jekyll did, and things were back in business. So, that person who emailed me, I did reply to them saying thank you. So if you're watching this video, thanks again for the report there. And yeah, even after the last 6 months or so, I haven't really noticed anything else being off. Nobody else emailed me about anything. I'm pretty happy with how things turned out. And yeah, when it comes to final thoughts here, in the end, I'm happy I made the switch, right? I would do it again, but I can't say that I'm 100% happy with Hugo. Like any tech choice, it's nearly impossible to find something that's perfect. I think Hugo has enough pros to be worth it for sure, especially if you have a decent sized site. I didn't have any real experience with Go prior to this. Didn't have to write any Go to get Hugo to work, but Go's templating language is it's pretty verbose and pretty like, I don't want to say non-intuitive. Non-intuitive for me might be a better way to put that one. I do appreciate the explicitness of it, right? But sometimes it's just a lot, and it's confusing to me. And there's a whole bunch of different footguns or stuff to be aware of. Personally, opinion-wise, I kind of prefer Liquid over it. But, I'm going to give it a chance. I don't think it's really horrible. But yeah, it's good enough for me. And it wasn't bad to get everything to work from ground zero. I didn't know anything about Go's templating language, really. I looked at some stuff casually. But yeah, 30 hours to convert an entire site without knowing it beforehand doesn't seem too bad. So I think it did actually quite well in that regard there. And then also, I kind of like how Jekyll is a little bit less restrictive on how and where you can use certain features. Like, for example, Hugo doesn't let you use partials in your content files, at least at the version that I used, right? Shortcodes are only available in your content files, and render hooks only apply to content files as well. What this really boils down to, though, is like, you have to duplicate a number of things between layouts and content files and keep like a mental track in your head of like how this stuff works here. And also sometimes like you have to create both a shortcode and a partial just so you can actually call the shortcode, which in turn calls a partial due to this restriction. I don't know, it just feels like it's not amazing, but it's not horrible. But it's like, again, things that are just different, I guess. You have to keep more things mentally in track. I feel like, again, I classify these as footguns, like things that you can accidentally do by accident because like there's no other way to do it or whatever. And then sometimes you can't actually use either of them. So it's like, you have to go back and start hard coding stuff in. Like the nav bar has links on my site that I have to actually hard code, like literally put in /blog instead of using one of the helpers there, just because there's no way to use that in that file there. And, Jekyll also lets you, by the way, define frontmatter in your layouts, which makes it very easy to make derivative layouts that are slightly different. Hugo doesn't let you do that, so you have to take more convoluted approaches to solve the same problem. I don't know, I'm not ragging on Hugo too much here, but it really reminds me of this like sharp knives philosophy that DHH wrote about, I don't know how many years ago, a decade ago, just around the idea that, you can write whatever Ruby code that you want here, but the language is not going to get in your way if you want to do something very specific to what you want to do. You know, maybe you know that, oh, it's a sharp knife. It's a little bit dangerous, but hey, you know what? I know what I'm doing. The language is going to give me the capability to do that. And then me as a developer, yeah, I'm empowered to make that decision on my own and choose when to reach for these tools as needed. But Go has a much different philosophy, right? And I think, honestly, that kind of leaks into the tools being created with it, right? Hugo feels like the author made certain design decisions. And guess what? Like, you pretty much have to stick with them to how they are. And that's it. That's the world. And, you know, in Hugo's defense, right, it has a lot of features baked in, and I didn't deeply explore each one. Maybe I missed something on how to do some of the other things that I couldn't find out how to do in a better way. Who knows? And I will say this, though, you know, I'm not an expert with Hugo or Go, but it's a super thought out project, and I can definitely appreciate all the hard work that went into it, the experience, the design. Like, it's not like, you know, someone just plopped this together yesterday. Like, a lot went into this, and a lot of people are using it successfully. I'm using it as well. And like, generally speaking, it's pretty solid. So I would, you know, do it and use it again as well. You know, my only concern with Hugo a bit is like, if I want to do something really custom, I'm actually not sure it's even possible to do. For example, you know, I've got this running in production podcast that, you know, if you've watched all my videos, you know that I stopped producing this one for now. But if you go and scroll down here, you can see we have like topics include, right? And it's a bulleted list here of, you know, little notes about certain areas. And if you click into this, then it will go and just like link you directly to that point in the actual audio. And that was done with a Jekyll plugin that I wrote, because the running in production site was a Jekyll site as well. And the markdown files for that Jekyll site for running in production, the way that it was working is this. I basically had a header called topics include, and all I had to do was put in this little markdown syntax, put in the timestamp of what I wanted, 2 dashes, and then whatever this is, and then that's what you get to see here. And it gets converted to a list, and the Jekyll plugin will actually go and convert this, you know, like human timestamp, like, you know, 7 minutes, 13 seconds to like a very specific like second marker, and then adjust like everything basically as needed. And this plugin here is basically that. And we're not going to go into all the details of it, but yeah, it uses basically, you know, Nokogiri again to like scan the file. It looks for a specific header, and then basically just injects like certain classes onto the links there. And it just like converts the time to what it needs to be to basically get things to work. And you know, again, super high level, I guess. Ooh, look at that. There's 2 colons. Only needs to be 1. I'll fix that as well. But, you know, look for that topics include heading. This is what the code is doing. You know, grab the next link in there, you know, split on the 2 dashes there, convert the time, and then like add the attributes. And, you know, so yeah, I'm not an expert with Hugo, so I'd actually be curious to see if you are. Like, what would you do to even solve that one? Because, you know, there are render hook for links here and headings, but not lists. But even if there were one for lists, then like, how would you just scope it to be a very specific list, not all of them, right? I know it can totally be solved with JavaScript. That's no problem. Trivial. I can do that in about an hour. But I just don't want to have that logic happen client side. I want all of that to happen server side, just to have it done and not being processed every single time the page loads in the client's device here. But yeah, this is basically done here. How long is this video? Oh, cool. 2 hours and 15 minutes. Imagine if you were watching the whole entire thing. Let me know in the comments below if you watched the entire thing. With that said, yeah, again, I hope you get some value out of this one. You know, this is really deep down in the woods, what it was like converting a 10-year-old project from Jekyll to Hugo. Overall, pretty successful, I would say. But yeah, let us know how it goes in the comments if you did it. Also, if you liked the video, please give a thumbs up. It really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.